Marriage is supposed to be built on trust, love, and protection. The person you choose to spend your life with should be your safest place in a dangerous world. But for the victims in these cases, the greatest threat didn't come from a stranger or an enemy. It came from the woman sleeping beside them every night, the mother of their children, the person they trusted completely. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary rage. These were calculated acts of violence that destroyed entire families, committed by women who once promised to love and cherish until death do them part. And the courts made sure that promise became literal, sentencing them to die behind bars or spend decades locked away. Today we're covering every single wife who went from perfect marriage to cold-blooded murder. What you're about to hear will destroy any illusions you have about the women who transformed from loving spouses into stone-cold killers, and the ultimate betrayal that landed them in a cell forever. Case number 1. Pamela Smart was a 22-year-old media services director at Winnacunnet High School in Hampton, New Hampshire, when her husband Greg Smart was murdered in their Derry condominium on May 1st, 1990. She had been married to Greg for just under a year. By all outward appearances, they were a young couple building their life together. Greg worked at an insurance company, and they had recently moved into their first home. Friends and family described them as happy newlyweds who seemed devoted to each other. Pamela was ambitious and career-focused, working at the local high school coordinating media equipment and student projects. She appeared to be a professional young woman with a bright future ahead of her. The marriage between Pamela and Greg began in May 1989, when Pamela was 21 and Greg was 24. They had dated for several years before getting married. Pamela had grown up in Florida and moved to New Hampshire where she met Greg. After their wedding, they settled into what seemed like typical married life for a young couple in their 20s. They lived in a small condominium in Derry, a town in southern New Hampshire. Greg worked selling insurance while Pamela pursued her career in education and media. To neighbours and acquaintances, nothing seemed unusual about their relationship. They were seen as an ordinary young married couple trying to establish themselves professionally and financially. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly normal marriage, Pamela had begun a secret relationship with a 15-year-old student at Winnacunnet High School named William Flynn. Pamela met Flynn through her work at the school. As the media services director, she supervised student workers and volunteer helpers who assisted with audiovisual equipment and school media projects. Flynn was one of these student helpers. He was a sophomore at the high school, just 15 years old when he first started working with Pamela in the media centre. What began as a professional relationship between a school employee and a student volunteer quickly developed into something inappropriate and illegal. Pamela was 22 years old and married when she initiated a sexual relationship with the teenage boy. Flynn later testified that Pamela pursued him romantically and that they began having sexual encounters in various locations, including her car, her office at school, and even in the condominium she shared with her husband. The relationship violated both the professional boundaries expected of a school employee and the legal boundaries regarding sexual contact between adults and minors. Flynn was below the age of consent in New Hampshire, making Pamela's sexual relationship with him statutory rape, regardless of whether the teenager believed he was participating willingly. As the affair between Pamela and Flynn continued through late 1989 and into early 1990, Pamela began expressing dissatisfaction with her marriage to Greg. She told Flynn that she was unhappy with her husband and wanted to be free to pursue a relationship with him openly. However, Pamela also discussed practical concerns about divorce. She talked about the financial implications of ending her marriage, including concerns about dividing assets and the costs associated with divorce proceedings. She had expensive tastes and enjoyed material possessions. The couple had furniture, electronics, and other belongings that would need to be divided. Pamela had insurance policies on Greg's life. She discussed these financial considerations with Flynn and other students she had befriended at the high school. During this period, Pamela had cultivated friendships with several teenagers at Winnacunnet High School. Beyond her sexual relationship with Flynn, she spent time with a group of students who hung around the media centre and seemed to enjoy the attention and admiration of these teenagers. Among this group were Flynn's friends Patrick Randall, Vance Latime, and Raymond Fowler. These boys were all around 15 or 16 years old and looked up to Pamela as a young, attractive authority figure who treated them like peers rather than students. Pamela would socialise with these teenagers outside of school, which should have raised red flags about professional boundaries, but apparently went unnoticed or unreported by other school staff. In early 1990, Pamela's conversations with Flynn took a darker turn. She began suggesting that the solution to her marital problems was not divorce, but the death of her husband. She told Flynn that if Greg were to die, she would collect on his life insurance policies and they could be together without the financial complications of divorce. Flynn later testified that Pamela brought up the idea of killing Greg multiple times over several weeks. She was persistent in discussing this possibility and presented it as the best solution for their situation. The teenager, deeply involved in a sexual relationship with an authority figure and manipulated by someone older and more experienced, eventually agreed to help make this happen. Pamela and Flynn recruited his friends to participate in the murder plot. Patrick Randall and Vance Latime were brought into the conspiracy. These were 16-year-old boys who were friends with Flynn and part of the social group that revolved around Pamela at the high school. The teenagers discussed various methods for killing Greg Smart. They talked about making it look like a robbery gone wrong so that police would not immediately suspect Pamela. They planned to break into the condominium, shoot Greg, and take some belongings to make it appear that burglars had killed him during a home invasion. Pamela provided information about when Greg would be home alone and what valuables should be taken to make the staged burglary look convincing. On May 1st, 1990, the plan was put into action. Pamela made sure she had an alibi by attending a school board meeting that evening. She needed to be in a public place with witnesses when the murder occurred, so she could not be immediately connected to the crime. While Pamela was at the meeting, Flynn, Randall and Latime drove to the Smart condominium in Derry. They brought a gun that belonged to Latime's father. The teenagers entered the condominium and confronted Greg Smart when he arrived home from work. The 24-year-old man was met by 3 teenage boys, one of whom was armed with a revolver. Greg Smart was forced to kneel on the floor of the foyer just inside the entrance to his home. William Flynn, the 15-year-old boy who had been having a sexual relationship with Greg's wife, held the gun. Flynn shot Greg Smart once in the head at close range, killing him almost instantly. The teenagers then ransacked parts of the condominium to make it look like a burglary. They took some jewelry, electronic equipment, and other items. They stole Greg's wallet to support the robbery narrative. The boys then fled the scene with the stolen items and the murder weapon. They drove away from the condominium, believing they had successfully executed a murder that would appear to be a random home invasion. Pamela returned home from the school board meeting to find police already at the scene. Neighbours had heard the gunshot and called authorities. When police arrived, they found Greg Smart's body in the foyer. He had been shot execution style, forced to kneel before being killed with a single gunshot to the head. Pamela acted shocked and distraught upon learning her husband had been murdered. She played the role of the grieving widow, crying and appearing devastated by the loss. Police initially treated her as a victim whose husband had been killed in what appeared to be a robbery. There was no immediate reason to suspect the young widow of involvement in her husband's death. The investigation into Greg Smart's murder initially focused on the possibility of a random break-in and robbery. Police noted that items were missing from the home and that there were signs of forced entry. However, certain details about the crime scene did not fit the pattern of a typical burglary. The execution-style shooting seemed unusual for a robbery. Most burglars flee when confronted rather than forcing victims to kneel and executing them. The specific items taken and those left behind also raised questions. Investigators began to suspect this might not be a random crime. As police investigated, they interviewed friends, family and co-workers of both Greg and Pamela Smart. During these interviews, some concerning information began to surface about Pamela's behaviour and relationships at Winnicott High School. Other staff members and students mentioned that Pamela seemed unusually close to certain male students. There were suggestions that her relationships with students crossed professional boundaries. Police began looking more closely at Pamela's activities and associations in the months leading up to the murder. The breakthrough in the case came from the teenagers themselves. Raymond Fowler, who had not been directly involved in the murder but knew about the plan, began talking to friends about what had happened. Fowler was 17 years old and had been part of the social circle around Pamela at the high school. He knew about the affair between Pamela and Flynn, and he knew about the murder conspiracy. After Greg Smart was killed, Fowler struggled with the knowledge of what his friends had done. He eventually confided in other people that Flynn and the others had murdered Greg Smart at the urging of Pamela. Information about Fowler's statements reached police investigators. They brought Fowler in for questioning, and he provided detailed information about the conspiracy to murder Greg Smart. Fowler explained that Pamela Smart had been having a sexual relationship with 15-year-old William Flynn and had convinced Flynn to kill her husband. He named Flynn, Randall, and Latime as the ones who carried out the actual murder. Fowler agreed to cooperate with police and help them gather evidence against the others involved in the conspiracy. Police arranged for Fowler to wear a recording device and have conversations with the other participants in the murder plot. In these recorded conversations, the teenagers discussed details of the murder and Pamela's role in planning it. Flynn admitted to shooting Greg Smart. Randall and Latime confirmed their participation. The recordings captured the teenagers talking about how Pamela had initiated the whole plan and had pushed Flynn to go through with killing her husband. These recordings provided crucial evidence that Pamela Smart was not a grieving widow, but rather the mastermind behind her husband's murder. Armed with this evidence, police arrested William Flynn, Patrick Randall, and Vance Latime for the murder of Greg Smart. The three teenagers were taken into custody and charged as adults with first-degree murder. They were 15 and 16 years old, but faced adult criminal proceedings because of the severity of the crime. Shortly after the teenagers were arrested, police also arrested Pamela Smart. She was charged with being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with a witness. The charges reflected that while Pamela had not been present at the murder scene and had not pulled the trigger herself, she had orchestrated the entire plot and manipulated teenagers into killing her husband for her. The arrests shocked the community in New Hampshire. The case quickly became a media sensation. A 22-year-old school employee had seduced a 15-year-old student and convinced him to murder her husband. The story had elements that captured public attention, including sexual misconduct, teenage killers, insurance money, and a seemingly normal young woman who turned out to be capable of orchestrating murder. Local news coverage expanded to national media attention. The case was covered extensively by newspapers, television news programs, and tabloid media outlets. Pamela Smart maintained her innocence from the time of her arrest. She claimed she had nothing to do with her husband's murder and that the teenagers were lying about her involvement. She admitted to having an affair with Flynn, but denied ever asking him to kill Greg. She suggested that Flynn and his friends had murdered Greg on their own, possibly motivated by jealousy or some other reason unrelated to any plan she had made. Pamela portrayed herself as a victim of teenage boys who had become obsessed with her and had acted violently without her knowledge or consent. The prosecution built their case around the testimony of the teenagers involved in the murder and the recordings that had been made by Raymond Fowler. The state planned to have Flynn, Randall, Latime and Fowler all testify about Pamela's role in planning the murder. The teenagers had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for more lenient sentences. Flynn agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder rather than face a first-degree murder trial. Randall and Latime also negotiated plea agreements in exchange for their testimony against Pamela Smart. The trial of Pamela Smart began in March 1991, nearly a year after Greg Smart's murder. The trial took place in Exeter, New Hampshire, and drew massive media attention. News cameras were allowed in the courtroom, and the trial was broadcast on television. This was still relatively uncommon at the time, and the televised trial became a national spectacle. People across the country watched as the case unfolded in the courtroom. The media coverage was intense and often sensationalized, with Pamela Smart's appearance, demeanor, and every detail of her life scrutinized and discussed publicly. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of Pamela's sexual relationship with the underage Flynn and her manipulation of the teenager to commit murder. William Flynn testified that Pamela had repeatedly discussed killing Greg and had told him it was the only way they could be together. He described how Pamela had provided details about when Greg would be home and what should be taken from the condominium to make it look like a burglary. Flynn testified that Pamela had pushed him to go through with the murder, even when he expressed doubts. He portrayed himself as a teenager who had been seduced and manipulated by an older woman in a position of authority. Patrick Randall testified about his involvement in the murder and confirmed that Pamela Smart had planned the whole thing. He described conversations where Pamela discussed killing her husband and the financial benefits she would gain from his death. Vance Latime provided similar testimony, corroborating the prosecution's narrative that Pamela was the driving force behind the conspiracy. Raymond Fowler testified about his knowledge of the affair and the murder plot, and the recordings he had made were played in court. In these recordings, the teenagers could be heard discussing Pamela's role in planning the murder and their own actions in carrying it out. The prosecution also presented evidence about Pamela's behaviour after the murder. She had quickly filed insurance claims on Greg's life insurance policies. She had shown little genuine grief, according to some witnesses. She had continued her relationship with Flynn even after Greg was killed, meeting with the teenager and maintaining contact despite having just lost her husband. This behaviour was presented as evidence of someone who had gotten exactly what she wanted, rather than someone genuinely mourning a spouse. The defence attempted to discredit the teenage witnesses by arguing they were unreliable and were testifying against Pamela to reduce their own criminal liability. Defense attorneys pointed out that Flynn, Randall, and Latime had all received plea deals in exchange for their testimony. They argued that these teenagers had motivation to lie and shift blame onto Pamela to minimize their own responsibility for the murder. The defense suggested that Flynn might have killed Greg Smart out of jealousy or obsession without Pamela's knowledge or encouragement. Pamela Smart testified in her own defense. She admitted to having an affair with Flynn, but denied involvement in any murder conspiracy. She claimed that Flynn had acted on his own and that she had never asked him to kill Greg. She portrayed herself as a young woman who had made a mistake by having an affair, but was not a murderer. She cried on the witness stand and insisted she loved her husband despite the affair. She maintained that she was innocent of the charges and that the teenagers were lying to save themselves from harsher punishment. The prosecution's cross-examination of Pamela was aggressive. They challenged her version of events and pointed out inconsistencies in her testimony. They questioned why multiple teenagers would all fabricate the same story about her involvement. They pressed her on the details of her relationship with Flynn and her actions after Greg's death. The cross-examination was designed to undermine her credibility and portray her as a manipulative liar, willing to say anything to avoid responsibility for her husband's murder. The trial lasted about 3 weeks. After hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury deliberated for approximately 13 hours before reaching a verdict. On March 22, 1991, the jury found Pamela Smart guilty of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. She was convicted on all charges related to the death of her husband. The jury believed the testimony of the teenagers and the evidence presented by the prosecution. They concluded that Pamela Smart had orchestrated the murder of Greg Smart by manipulating her teenage lover into killing him. The conviction carried severe consequences. Under New Hampshire law at the time, the sentence for being an accomplice to first-degree murder was life in prison without the possibility of parole. On May 21, 1991, Pamela Smart was formally sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, with no chance of ever being released. The judge also imposed additional consecutive sentences for the conspiracy and witness tampering convictions, though these were largely symbolic, given that she was already facing life without parole. William Flynn, who actually pulled the trigger and shot Greg Smart, received a lighter sentence because of his cooperation and his age at the time of the crime. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 28 years to life in prison. He became eligible for parole after serving 28 years. Patrick Randall pleaded guilty to being an accomplice to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 28 years to life. Vance Latime pleaded guilty to being an accomplice to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 18 years to life with the possibility of parole. Raymond Fowler, who did not participate directly in the murder but knew about the plot and initially helped cover it up before cooperating with police, pleaded guilty to being an accessory to murder and received a sentence of 18 years to life. The sentencing disparity became a point of controversy. Pamela Smart, who did not physically kill anyone and was not present when the murder occurred, received life without parole. Meanwhile, William Flynn, who actually shot Greg Smart in the head, received a sentence that made him eligible for parole. The teenagers who carried out the murder would all potentially be released from prison someday, while Pamela would never be free. Prosecutors and the judge justified this by arguing that Pamela was the mastermind who corrupted minors and manipulated them into committing murder. She was an adult in a position of authority who had abused that position to convince teenagers to kill for her. The severity of her sentence reflected the court's view that she bore primary responsibility for the crime, despite not being the one who pulled the trigger. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 2. Case number 2. Mary Winkler was a 32-year-old mother of 3 living in Selma, Tennessee, when she shot and killed her husband Matthew Winkler on March 22, 2006. Matthew was 31 years old and served as the minister at the 4th Street Church of Christ in Selma, a small town in southwestern Tennessee. To their congregation and community, the Winklers appeared to be a model family. Matthew was a respected young preacher who delivered sermons every Sunday and was actively involved in church activities. Mary was the minister's wife who taught Sunday school classes and participated in church events with their 3 young daughters. The family seemed to embody the values they preached, living a quiet life centered around faith and community service. Matthew Winkler came from a family with deep roots in the Church of Christ. His father was also a minister, and Matthew had grown up in the church. He attended a Church of Christ affiliated college and pursued ministry as his life's calling. He was known as a dedicated preacher who took his religious duties seriously. Matthew had served at various churches before accepting the position at 4th Street Church of Christ in Selma in 2005. The family moved to Selma so Matthew could lead this congregation. They lived in a parsonage provided by the church, a modest home where they could raise their daughters while Matthew fulfilled his ministerial responsibilities. Mary Carol Freeman met Matthew Winkler when they were both students at a Church of Christ affiliated school. Mary had also grown up in the Church of Christ and came from a religious family. She and Matthew married in 1996 when Mary was 22 years old. They started their family soon after, eventually having 3 daughters. The girls were 9, 7, and 1 year old at the time of Matthew's death. Mary embraced the role of a minister's wife, which came with certain expectations in their conservative religious community. She was expected to support her husband's ministry, participate actively in church functions, teach classes, and present a wholesome family image to the congregation. Life as a minister's family in a small town meant living under constant scrutiny. Church members and community members watched the Winkler family closely. Ministers and their families were expected to be examples of Christian living, maintaining high moral standards and avoiding any behaviour that might bring criticism to the church. Mary was responsible for managing the household, caring for 3 children, and fulfilling her duties as the minister's wife, while Matthew focused on his preaching and pastoral duties. The family lived on a minister's salary, which was modest, and they had to be careful with finances. Behind the appearance of a happy Christian family, Mary Winkler was struggling with problems she felt unable to share with anyone. She later revealed that she had been experiencing financial difficulties that she had hidden from Matthew. Mary had been managing the family's finances and had made some poor decisions that resulted in mounting debt. She had written checks that bounced, creating overdraft fees and penalties. She had been receiving threatening notices from banks about overdrawn accounts. The financial problems were spiralling, and Mary felt trapped because she was afraid to tell Matthew what had happened. In addition to the financial stress, Mary later testified that there were serious problems in her marriage that nobody outside the family knew about. She claimed that Matthew had been controlling and psychologically abusive during their marriage. She described him as demanding and critical, creating an environment where she felt constantly anxious about meeting his expectations. Mary also made allegations during her trial that Matthew had forced her to participate in sexual activities she found degrading and painful. She testified that he had shown her pornography and pressured her to dress in provocative costumes and engage in sexual acts that made her uncomfortable. These allegations painted a picture of a marriage that was very different from the wholesome image the family presented to their church and community. Mary also revealed that Matthew had criticised her appearance and weight. She said he would make comments about her body and expressed dissatisfaction with how she looked. This added to her feelings of inadequacy and low self-worth. Mary described living in fear of Matthew's reactions and disapproval. She portrayed herself as a woman trapped in a marriage where she was controlled, criticised, and forced to participate in activities that violated her sense of dignity and religious values. On the evening of March 22, 2006, something happened that led Mary Winkler to make a deadly decision. The exact sequence of events and what specifically triggered the shooting has been subject to different interpretations. Mary's account was that she and Matthew had an argument about money that evening. She said she had been trying to work up the courage to tell him about the financial problems she had been hiding. According to Mary, when she tried to discuss the situation with Matthew, he became angry. She described him as being furious about the financial mess she had created. Mary stated that during this confrontation, she went to the bedroom closet where Matthew kept a shotgun. The gun was a Remington 12-gauge shotgun that Matthew owned. Mary retrieved the gun and returned to where Matthew was in the bedroom. According to her testimony, she did not plan to kill him, but wanted to force him to listen to her and talk about their problems. She said she pointed the gun at him to make him stop and pay attention. Mary claimed that she was not intending to shoot Matthew, but that the gun went off accidentally while she was holding it pointed in his direction. The shotgun blast struck Matthew Winkler in the back. The pellets from the shotgun entered his back and caused severe internal damage. Matthew did not die immediately. He was conscious after being shot and aware of what had happened. Mary's actions after pulling the trigger would become a crucial part of the case against her. Instead of immediately calling for help, Mary did not call 911. She did not attempt to get emergency medical assistance for her severely wounded husband. Matthew was lying in the bedroom, critically injured and bleeding, but Mary made a choice that would be difficult to explain or justify. Mary wrapped Matthew's body in a blanket or sheet while he was still alive. Matthew was aware and conscious during this time. He knew his wife had shot him and was now covering him with bedding. Mary then left the bedroom, with Matthew still alive, but gravely wounded. She went to get their 3 daughters and began packing belongings. She loaded the children into the family minivan, along with some clothes and personal items. Mary then drove away from the house in Selma with her 3 daughters, leaving Matthew alone in the bedroom, where he would eventually die from his injuries. The decision to leave Matthew without calling for medical help was one of the most damaging aspects of Mary's case. Even if the shooting had been accidental or had occurred during a moment of panic or fear, the choice to leave him to die rather than seek emergency assistance showed a level of intentionality that was hard to reconcile with claims of an accident or temporary insanity. Matthew Winkler died alone in the bedroom of the parsonage, bleeding to death from the shotgun wound to his back. If Mary had called 911 immediately after the shooting, he might have survived. Instead, she chose to flee. Mary drove through the night with her 3 young daughters in the van. She headed west from Tennessee toward the Gulf Coast. She drove for hours, eventually crossing state lines into Alabama. The next day, March 23rd, Mary continued driving south until she reached Orange Beach, Alabama, a beach town on the Gulf of Mexico. She checked into a motel with her 3 daughters using her real name. Mary and the children spent time on the beach. Witnesses later reported seeing a woman matching Mary's description with 3 young girls playing in the sand and appearing to be on a normal family vacation. This behaviour would also be used against her during the trial, as it suggested someone who was not in a state of panic or remorse, but rather someone who had made a deliberate decision to run. Meanwhile, back in Selma, Tennessee, Matthew Winkler's absence was noticed when he failed to appear for evening church services on March 22nd. It was unusual for the minister to miss services without notification, and church members became concerned. When attempts to contact Matthew went unanswered, church members went to the parsonage to check on the family. They found the house quiet and nobody answered the door. Concerned church members contacted authorities and eventually gained entry to the home. Inside the house, police found Matthew Winkler's body in the bedroom. He had been dead for hours by the time he was discovered. The shotgun blast to his back had caused fatal injuries, and he had bled to death. Police immediately began investigating what appeared to be a homicide. They noted that Mary and the 3 children were missing, along with the family's minivan. The combination of a dead minister and his missing wife and children prompted an immediate investigation and search. Police quickly determined that this was likely a domestic incident rather than a break-in or random violence. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery. The shotgun that had been used to kill Matthew was found in the home. It appeared that Mary had shot her husband and then fled with the children. Authorities issued an Amber Alert for the 3 Winkler daughters and began a search for Mary and the children. The case immediately attracted media attention. A church minister had been murdered, and his wife and children had disappeared. The story had all the elements that draw public interest, including religion, a seemingly perfect family, and a shocking act of violence. Law enforcement traced Mary's movements by tracking her use of credit cards and bank withdrawals. They determined that she had driven south and was likely headed toward the Gulf Coast. On March 23rd, just over 24 hours after Matthew was killed, police located Mary Winkler at a motel in Orange Beach, Alabama. She was arrested without incident, while her 3 daughters were present. The children were unharmed and were taken into protective custody. Mary was charged with first-degree murder in the death of her husband, Matthew Winkler. The arrest of Mary Winkler shocked the Church of Christ community and drew national media coverage. A minister's wife had killed her husband and fled with their children. The case raised questions about what could have driven a seemingly devoted wife and mother to commit such a violent act. Mary was extradited back to Tennessee to face charges. She was held without bond initially, as prosecutors prepared their case for first-degree murder, which could potentially carry the death penalty or life in prison. As the case developed, details began to emerge about possible problems in the Winkler marriage. Mary's defense attorneys worked to present a picture of their client as a battered woman who had suffered years of abuse and had finally snapped under the pressure. They prepared to argue that Mary had killed Matthew in a moment of desperation after enduring psychological and sexual abuse. The defense strategy was to generate sympathy for Mary by portraying her as a victim who had been pushed to the breaking point. The Church of Christ community and Matthew's family strongly disputed any claims that he had been abusive. They described Matthew as a loving husband and father, a dedicated minister, and a man of strong Christian character. They insisted that Mary's allegations of abuse were fabrications designed to justify murder. Matthew's family was devastated, not only by his death, but by the accusations being made against him after he was no longer alive to defend himself. They fought to preserve his reputation and challenged the narrative that Mary's defense team was constructing. The trial of Mary Winkler began in April 2007, more than a year after Matthew's death. The trial took place in Selma, Tennessee, the same small town where the murder had occurred. The case drew intense media attention, with news crews from across the country covering the proceedings. The prosecution charged Mary with first-degree murder, arguing that she had intentionally killed her husband. They presented evidence that Mary had retrieved the shotgun, pointed it at Matthew, and pulled the trigger. They emphasized that after shooting him, she had left him to die without calling for help and had fled the state with their children. This behavior, they argued, showed consciousness of guilt and deliberate action rather than an accident or a moment of temporary insanity. The prosecution addressed Mary's claims about the shooting being accidental. Forensic evidence showed that Matthew had been shot in the back, which made it difficult to support a claim of an accidental discharge during a confrontation. If Mary had been facing Matthew and pointing the gun at him to get his attention, as she claimed, the shot would likely have struck him in the front of his body. The fact that he was shot in the back suggested he may have been turned away from Mary when she fired, possibly trying to leave the room or avoid confrontation. This detail undermined Mary's version of events. The defense presented Mary's testimony about the abuse she had suffered during her marriage. Mary took the stand and described years of living under Matthew's control. She testified about his criticisms, his demands, and the sexual activities he forced her to participate in. She became emotional while testifying, crying as she described her feelings of helplessness and fear. The defense also presented evidence of the financial problems Mary had been dealing with, including bank statements showing overdrafts and bounced checks. They argued that Mary had been under tremendous stress from the financial crisis she was hiding and the abuse she was enduring. The defense called expert witnesses who testified about battered woman syndrome and the psychological effects of long-term abuse. These experts explained how victims of abuse can reach a breaking point where they act in ways that seem irrational to outside observers. They suggested that Mary's decision to shoot Matthew and then flee was the result of years of accumulated trauma and fear rather than calculated murder. The defense argued that Mary should be convicted of a lesser charge, such as voluntary manslaughter, rather than first-degree murder, because she had acted in a moment of passion or extreme emotional disturbance, rather than with premeditation. The jury heard testimony from both sides over several days. They learned about the Winklers' marriage, the shooting, and Mary's flight to Alabama with the children. They saw photographs of the crime scene and heard from forensic experts about Matthew's injuries. They listened to Mary's emotional testimony about abuse and heard the prosecution's arguments that she was lying to avoid responsibility for murder. The case came down to whether the jury believed Mary's claims about abuse and whether they felt her actions were those of a desperate victim or a calculating killer. After deliberating, the jury reached a verdict that surprised many observers. On April 19, 2007, the jury found Mary Winkler not guilty of first-degree murder. However, they did not acquit her entirely. Instead, they convicted her of voluntary manslaughter. This verdict meant the jury believed Mary had killed Matthew intentionally, but that there were mitigating circumstances that reduced her culpability from murder to manslaughter. The voluntary manslaughter conviction suggested the jury accepted at least some of Mary's claims about the problems in her marriage and her emotional state at the time of the shooting. The conviction for voluntary manslaughter carried a much lighter sentence than first-degree murder would have. In Tennessee, voluntary manslaughter can carry a sentence of 3 to 6 years in prison. On June 8, 2007, Mary Winkler was sentenced to 3 years in prison for killing her husband. However, the judge suspended all but 210 days of the sentence and gave her credit for the 5 months she had already served in jail awaiting trial. This meant Mary would serve only about 60 more days behind bars for killing her husband. She was also placed on probation for the remainder of her sentence. The lenient sentence outraged many people, particularly Matthew's family and members of the Church of Christ community. They felt that justice had not been served. Matthew Winkler was dead. His 3 daughters had lost their father, and the woman who killed him would serve less than a year in jail. Matthew's family fought for custody of the three Winkler children. They argued that Mary was an unfit mother who had killed the children's father and should not be allowed to raise them. A custody battle ensued between Mary and Matthew's parents. Mary Winkler was released from jail in August 2007 after serving her reduced sentence. She had to fight to regain custody of her daughters. The custody dispute was eventually resolved, with Mary being granted custody of her children, though Matthew's parents were given visitation rights. Mary moved away from Selma and tried to rebuild her life with her daughters, away from the intense scrutiny and judgment of the community where the murder had occurred. The case of Mary Winkler sparked debate about domestic violence, battered woman syndrome, and the justice system. Supporters of Mary argued that she was a victim of abuse, who had been driven to a desperate act, and that the justice system had correctly recognised mitigating circumstances. Critics argued that Mary had gotten away with murder, receiving an inappropriately light sentence for taking a human life. They pointed out that Matthew was never convicted of abuse, and that Mary's allegations came only after she was charged with his murder, making them impossible to verify and suspiciously convenient for her defence. Questions were raised about the physical evidence that Mary claims supported her abuse allegations. During the trial, the defence presented photographs of what they said were wig and platform shoes that Matthew had forced Mary to wear during sexual encounters. These items were supposed to corroborate Mary's testimony about sexual abuse. However, critics pointed out that the existence of these items only proved they were in the house, not that Matthew had forced Mary to use them or that any abuse had actually occurred. The shooting itself remained controversial. The fact that Matthew was shot in the back contradicted Mary's claim that the gun went off accidentally while she was pointing it at him during a confrontation. The decision to leave him without medical help and to flee with the children suggested premeditation rather than a panic response to an accident. Mary's behaviour after the shooting, including the trip to the beach and checking into a motel, seemed inconsistent with someone who had just experienced a traumatic accident or who was in genuine fear for her safety. Matthew Winkler's family maintained that he was a good man who had been murdered by his wife and then had his reputation destroyed by false accusations he could not defend against. They argued that Mary had created a narrative of abuse to justify her actions and to manipulate the jury into sympathy. They felt the justice system had failed Matthew by believing Mary's uncorroborated allegations and giving her a sentence that did not reflect the severity of taking a human life. The three Winkler daughters lost their father and spent time separated from their mother during the legal proceedings. They experienced trauma from the murder, the arrest, the custody battle, and the intense media attention surrounding their family. The long-term effects on these children became part of the tragedy of the case. Whatever the truth about the Winkler marriage, three young girls were left without a father and had to grow up knowing their mother had killed him. Mary Winkler completed her probation and continued living quietly with her daughters. She avoided media attention and did not seek to publicise her story after her release. The case faded from national headlines, but remained a subject of discussion in legal and domestic violence circles. Some saw it as an example of the justice system appropriately recognising the effects of abuse on victims' behaviour. Others saw it as an example of someone literally getting away with murder by making unprovable accusations against a victim who could not defend himself. The Church of Christ community was deeply affected by the case. It raised uncomfortable questions about what might happen behind closed doors in seemingly perfect religious families. It challenged assumptions about ministers and their families being immune to the problems that affect other marriages. It also raised questions about the pressures placed on ministers' wives and whether the expectations and scrutiny contributed to Mary's situation. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 3. Case number 3. Jodi Arias was a 27-year-old woman living in California when she killed her former boyfriend Travis Alexander on June 4th, 2008. Travis was a 30-year-old motivational speaker and salesman who lived in Mesa, Arizona. The murder was extraordinarily violent and involved multiple forms of attack. Travis was stabbed 27 times, his throat was slashed from ear to ear, and he was shot in the head. The brutal nature of the killing and the bizarre behaviour of Jodi Arias before and after the murder made this case one of the most publicised criminal trials in American history. Travis Alexander was a practicing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and worked as a salesman for a company called Prepaid Legal Services. He was known as a charismatic and energetic person who gave motivational speeches and was successful in his sales career. Travis lived alone in a house in Mesa, Arizona, and was active in his local church community. He had many friends and was generally well liked by people who knew him. Travis was not married and dated various women while maintaining his involvement in church activities and his professional life. Jodi Arias met Travis Alexander in September 2006 at a business convention in Las Vegas. Jodi was working as a photographer and was also involved with prepaid legal services. The two were introduced by mutual friends at the convention and felt an immediate attraction to each other. Despite living in different states, they began a romantic relationship soon after meeting. Jodi was living in California at the time, while Travis lived in Arizona, so their relationship involved long-distance communication and periodic visits. Jodi converted to the Mormon faith shortly after meeting Travis in November 2006. She was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and began attending church services. This conversion appeared to be influenced by her relationship with Travis, who was a devout member of the church. The Mormon faith places strong emphasis on moral purity and sexual abstinence before marriage. This religious framework would become relevant to understanding the dynamics of their relationship and the events that led to Travis's death. The relationship between Jodi and Travis was tumultuous from the beginning. Friends of Travis later described the relationship as intense and unstable. Jodi became increasingly attached to Travis, and her behavior began to show signs of obsession. She moved from California to Mesa, Arizona in 2007 to be closer to Travis. She rented an apartment not far from his house, which allowed her to see him more frequently, but also made it easier for her to monitor his activities and show up unexpectedly. Despite being in a relationship with Jodi, Travis continued to date other women. He was looking for someone to marry within his faith, and apparently had concerns about whether Jodi was the right person for him long-term. Travis and Jodi officially ended their romantic relationship in the summer of 2007, after dating for about 9 months. However, they continued to see each other and maintained a sexual relationship even after they were no longer officially dating. This arrangement created confusion and emotional turmoil, particularly for Jodi, who wanted to be in a committed relationship with Travis. After the official breakup, Jodi's behavior became increasingly concerning to Travis and his friends. She would show up at his house unannounced. She accessed his Facebook account and email without permission by figuring out his passwords. Friends reported that Jodi would spy on Travis through windows of his house and follow him when he went out with other women. Travis confided in friends that he felt Jodi was stalking him and that her behavior was becoming frightening. He told multiple people that Jodi was acting obsessively and that he was trying to distance himself from her. In early 2008, Jodi moved back to California, settling in Yreka in Northern California to live with her grandparents. The physical distance did not end her obsession with Travis. They continued to communicate by phone, text messages, and email. They also continued their sexual relationship despite no longer being together romantically, and despite the teachings of their shared Mormon faith about sexual purity. Travis was simultaneously pursuing relationships with other women who he considered more suitable as potential wives, while maintaining the sexual relationship with Jodi. Travis began seriously dating another woman in early 2008. He was planning to take a trip to Cancun, Mexico with this woman in June 2008. The trip was a reward for his success in sales, and he invited the woman he was interested in marrying to accompany him. Jodi was aware of this developing relationship and the upcoming trip. Evidence later showed that she was extremely jealous and upset about Travis moving on with another woman while still maintaining contact with her. On June 2, 2008, Jodi rented a car from a budget rental office in Redding, California. This location was about 90 miles from where she lived in Yreka. Jodi later claimed she rented the car in Redding rather than in her hometown because the Redding location had better rates. But prosecutors would argue she did this to avoid creating a record of rental activity in her own town. She specifically requested a white or light-coloured car, but was given a red Ford Focus because no light-coloured cars were available. Jodi initially hesitated, but ultimately accepted the red car. After renting the car, Jodi drove to visit an ex-boyfriend named Daryl Brewer, who lived in Monterey, California. She borrowed 2 gas cans from him, telling him she needed them for a road trip. She already owned 1 gas can, so with the borrowed cans she now had 3 5-gallon gas cans in her possession. Jodi later claimed she needed extra gas because she was planning to drive through remote areas where gas stations might be scarce or closed. Prosecutors would argue that the gas cans were intended to allow her to travel to and from Arizona without creating a record of gas purchases that would place her in Arizona at the time of the murder. On June 3, 2008, Jody visited another ex-boyfriend named Ryan Burns, who lived in West Jordan, Utah. She had planned to visit Ryan after he invited her to attend a business event with him. However, Jody did not drive directly from California to Utah. Cell phone records and other evidence would later show that she drove from California to Arizona, arriving at Travis Alexander's house in Mesa in the early morning hours of June 4th. Jody would later claim that the visit to Travis's house was not planned, that she got lost while driving to Utah and ended up at his house spontaneously. She said Travis was happy to see her and invited her in. However, phone records and other evidence suggested the visit was premeditated. Jody had turned off her cell phone before entering Arizona and did not turn it back on until she was well outside the state, an action that appeared designed to prevent her phone from creating a record of her location in Arizona. What happened inside Travis Alexander's house on June 4, 2008, became the central question of the murder case. According to Jody's eventual testimony, she arrived at Travis's house around 4 a.m. She said Travis was awake and they spent the day together talking, watching movies, and having sex. She claimed they took photographs of each other in sexual poses and later took pictures of Travis in the shower. She said that around 5:30 p.m., while Travis was in the shower, she dropped his camera and Travis became angry and violent toward her. The physical evidence told a different story than Jody's accounts, which changed multiple times. Travis Alexander was attacked while he was in the shower of his master bathroom. The evidence showed that he was first stabbed multiple times while in the shower area. The injuries included stab wounds to his head, chest, and back. Travis tried to defend himself, receiving defensive wounds on his hands. He managed to get out of the shower and tried to escape, making it to the bathroom sink area, where blood evidence showed he had been standing or leaning. The attack continued as Travis tried to get away from his attacker. He was stabbed repeatedly as he moved from the shower to the sink area and then toward the bedroom. The hallway outside the bathroom showed a trail of blood, indicating Travis had tried to escape while being stabbed. The medical examiner would later determine that Travis had been stabbed 27 times in total. The wounds were to his head, neck, back, and torso. Some of the stab wounds hit major blood vessels and organs. After stabbing Travis multiple times, his throat was slashed. The cut went from ear to ear and was so deep it nearly decapitated him. This wound severed his carotid arteries and jugular veins, causing massive blood loss. The throat slashing likely occurred while Travis was already incapacitated or dying from the stab wounds. Finally, Travis was shot in the head with a .25 caliber gun. The gunshot entered his right eyebrow area. There is debate about whether the gunshot occurred at the beginning, middle, or end of the attack, but the medical examiner concluded it was likely the final injury. After the attack, Travis Alexander's body was dragged back into the shower and left there. The crime scene showed that someone had made minimal attempts to clean up. The camera that Jody later claimed she had dropped was found in the washing machine in the laundry room, having been run through a wash cycle. Also in the washing machine were bedding and other items that appeared to have blood on them. The person who killed Travis had attempted to destroy photographic evidence and clean up some of the blood, but had left the majority of the crime scene intact. The camera found in the washing machine would become crucial evidence. Investigators were able to recover deleted photographs from the camera's memory card, even though it had been through the wash cycle. The photos showed images of Travis and Jody in sexual positions taken on the afternoon of June 4th. There were also photos of Travis in the shower taken shortly before his death. The timestamps on these photos established a timeline of events on the day of the murder. Most significantly, the recovered photos included accidental images that appeared to have been taken during the attack. These images were blurry and showed portions of the bathroom, Travis's body, and what appeared to be a pant leg and a foot. One image showed Travis on the bathroom floor with blood visible. Another showed what appeared to be Jody's pant leg near Travis's body. The timestamps on these accidental photos pinpointed the time of the attack to around 5:30 p.m. on June 4th. These photos were apparently taken when the camera was dropped and the shutter was accidentally triggered during the violent struggle. After killing Travis, Jody left his house and continued driving to Utah to visit Ryan Burns. She arrived at Ryan's house in West Jordan, Utah in the early morning hours of June 5th, more than 12 hours later than she had told him to expect her. She explained her late arrival by saying she had gotten lost and her phone had died. Ryan later told investigators that Jody seemed normal when she arrived, though she had some cuts on her hands that she explained as injuries from broken glass at her work. Jody spent the day of June 5th with Ryan Burns. They attended a business meeting together and spent time with his friends. People who saw Jody that day said she seemed normal and friendly. She gave no indication that she had just committed a brutal murder less than 24 hours earlier. She was affectionate with Ryan and acted as if she was interested in pursuing a relationship with him. This behaviour would later be used by prosecutors to show that Jody was able to lie convincingly and appear normal even after committing extreme violence. Meanwhile, back in Mesa, Arizona, Travis Alexander's body remained undiscovered in his house. Travis had been planning to leave for his trip to Cancun on June 10th. When he failed to answer phone calls and did not show up for a conference call on the evening of June 4th, friends became concerned, but assumed he might be busy or had his phone turned off. As days passed with no contact from Travis, his friends became increasingly worried. On June 9th, 2008, friends of Travis went to his house to check on him. They had a bad feeling that something was wrong. When they arrived, the house was locked and there was no answer. They could see that Travis's car was still in the garage. They eventually gained entry to the house and began searching for Travis. The house appeared mostly normal, though there were some concerning signs. When they reached the master bedroom and bathroom, they discovered Travis's body in the shower, where it had been for 5 days. The friends who found Travis were traumatized by the discovery. They immediately called the police. When investigators arrived, they encountered one of the most violent crime scenes many of them had ever seen. The amount of blood throughout the bathroom and hallway indicated a prolonged and brutal attack. The body showed evidence of overkill, meaning the attacker had inflicted far more damage than necessary to cause death. This suggested a crime of passion or rage rather than a simple murder. Police began investigating Travis Alexander's murder by interviewing his friends and family to learn about his life and relationships. Travis's friends immediately mentioned Jodi Arias as someone who had been obsessed with Travis and had stalked him. They described her possessive behaviour and Travis's complaints about her showing up uninvited and spying on him. Friends told police that Travis had been afraid of Jodi and had tried to end contact with her, but she would not leave him alone. Investigators contacted Jodi Arias on June 10, 2008. She was still in California at that point, having returned from her trip to Utah. When detectives called her to ask about Travis, Jodi acted shocked and distraught to hear that he was dead. She cried and asked what had happened. She gave no indication that she had been to Travis's house or that she had any knowledge of his death. When asked when she had last seen Travis, Jodi said it had been in April 2008, 2 months before the murder. She claimed she had not been to Arizona in months. This was the first of several different stories Jodi would tell about her involvement in Travis's death. She maintained complete innocence initially, claiming she had not been in Arizona and knew nothing about the murder. She suggested that Travis might have been killed by intruders or someone connected to his work. She presented herself as a grieving ex-girlfriend who was devastated by the news of his death. As investigators gathered evidence, it became clear that Jodi was lying. The rental car records showed she had rented a car on June 2nd and returned it on June 7th, with the floor mats missing and what appeared to be bloodstains in the vehicle. She had driven nearly 3,000 miles during the rental period, far more than necessary for a trip from California to Utah and back. Gas station receipts showed she had filled up the car and the gas cans she was carrying multiple times, and there was a suspicious gap in the receipts during the time she would have been driving through Arizona. Cell phone records showed that Jodi's phone had been turned off before she entered Arizona and was not turned back on until she was in Nevada on her way to Utah. The phone's location data showed no activity in Arizona, but the pattern of turning the phone off and on suggested intentional avoidance of creating location records. Most damning were the recovered photographs from Travis's camera, showing Jodi was at his house on the day of the murder, and the accidental photos showing her presence during the attack. Faced with this evidence, Jodi changed her story. In September 2008, she gave an interview to a television news program where she admitted she had been at Travis's house on June 4th, but claimed 2 intruders had broken in and attacked Travis while she was there. She said a man and a woman had entered the house, attacked Travis, and threatened to kill her too. She claimed the woman pointed a gun at her, while the man killed Travis. She said she managed to escape and fled in fear for her life. This story was immediately questioned by investigators and the public. If intruders had attacked Travis and threatened Jodi, why had she not reported it to police? Why had she lied initially about being in Arizona? Why had she continued to Utah and acted normal with Ryan Burns? Why was her DNA and blood found mixed with Travis's blood at the crime scene? The intruder story did not explain the evidence and created more questions than answers. Jodi was arrested and charged with first-degree murder on July 15, 2008. She was taken into custody in California and extradited to Arizona to face trial. She was held without bond in the Maricopa County Jail in Phoenix. The case began to attract media attention because of the brutal nature of the murder and the strange behavior of the defendant. The fact that there were photographs of the victim and defendant together on the day of the murder, including sexual images, added to the public interest in the case. While in jail awaiting trial, Jodi gave multiple interviews to news media. She appeared on television programs and spoke with reporters, maintaining her story about intruders killing Travis. She also did magazine interviews and appeared eager to tell her side of the story publicly. This behavior was unusual for someone charged with murder and would later be criticized as attention-seeking and manipulative. During these interviews, Jodi often appeared calm and unemotional when discussing the violent death of someone she claimed to have loved. The trial of Jodi Arias began in January 2013, more than 4 years after the murder. The delay was due to various legal proceedings, changes in defense attorneys, and the complexity of the case. The trial was held in Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, Arizona. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that the murder was committed in an especially cruel manner and that Jodi should face the ultimate punishment. The case was televised, with cameras in the courtroom broadcasting the proceedings live on cable news networks and streaming online. The trial became a media sensation. Millions of people watched the proceedings on television and online. The combination of sex, religion, obsession, and brutal violence made the case compelling to viewers. The fact that there were explicit photographs and detailed testimony about the sexual relationship between Jodi and Travis added to the prurient interest. The trial dominated cable news coverage for months and became a cultural phenomenon, with people taking strong positions on whether Jodi was a cold-blooded killer or a victim of abuse. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of Jodi's guilt. They showed the jury the recovered photographs from Travis's camera, including the images of Jodi and Travis together on the day of the murder and the accidental photos taken during the attack. They presented the rental car records, cell phone records, and gas station receipts showing Jodi's journey to Arizona and back. They called Travis's friends who testified about Jodi's stalking behavior and Travis's fear of her. They presented DNA evidence showing Jodi's blood mixed with Travis's blood at the crime scene. The medical examiner testified about the extensive injuries Travis had suffered. The jury saw graphic autopsy photos showing the 27 stab wounds and the deep throat slashing. The medical examiner explained that Travis had likely been conscious for part of the attack and had tried to defend himself and escape. The cruelty of the murder was emphasized by prosecutors, who argued that Travis had suffered tremendously before dying and that Jodi had shown no mercy during the prolonged attack. Prosecutors also focused on Jodi's behavior after the murder. They showed that she had called Travis's phone and left voicemail messages, acting as if she did not know he was dead. She had sent text messages to Travis's phone. She had attended his memorial service and comforted his family while knowing she was the one who killed him. This behavior demonstrated a capacity for deception and manipulation that prosecutors argued proved she was a calculating killer rather than someone who had acted in self-defense or during a moment of passion. After presenting the intruder story for years, Jodi changed her account again at trial. She now admitted that she had killed Travis, but claimed it was in self-defense. This was her third different version of events. She testified that Travis had attacked her in a rage after she dropped his camera, and that she had fought back to defend herself. She claimed Travis had been physically and emotionally abusive throughout their relationship, and that she was afraid for her life during their final confrontation. Jodi took the stand in her own defense and testified for 18 days, an extraordinarily long time for a defendant to testify. She described her relationship with Travis in detail, including explicit descriptions of their sexual activities. She portrayed Travis as a sexual deviant who used her for sex while being ashamed of her in public because she did not fit the image he wanted as a Mormon preparing to marry in the temple. She claimed Travis had been violent with her on multiple occasions and that she lived in fear of his temper. According to Jodi's trial testimony, on June 4th, Travis became enraged when she dropped his camera while taking photos of him in the shower. She claimed he exploded in anger, body slammed her to the tile floor, and began attacking her. She said she ran to his closet, where she knew he kept a gun on a high shelf. She claimed she grabbed the gun to defend herself, and that it accidentally went off when Travis lunged at her. She said she had no memory of stabbing him and that she must have done it during a dissociative state caused by extreme fear and stress. The self-defense claim faced immediate problems. The forensic evidence did not support Jodi's version of events. Travis's defensive wounds showed he was trying to protect himself, not attack someone. The location and nature of the wounds showed he was trying to escape, not advancing on an attacker. The gun Jodi claimed to have grabbed from Travis's closet was the same caliber as a gun that had been stolen from Jodi's grandparents' house in California a week before the murder, suggesting Jodi had brought the weapon with her. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 4. Case number 4. Elizabeth Ann Broderick, known as Betty, was a 41-year-old mother of 4 when she shot and killed her ex-husband Dan Broderick and his new wife Linda Kolkina Broderick on November 5, 1989. The murders took place in the early morning hours at Dan and Linda's home in the Marston Hills neighborhood of San Diego, California. Betty entered their bedroom while they were sleeping and fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber revolver, killing both of them. The case became one of the most famous murder trials in American history because it raised questions about divorce, revenge, obsession, and what happens when a bitter marital breakup spirals completely out of control. Betty Broderick was born Elizabeth Ann Biseglia in November 1947 in New York. She grew up in a large Irish Catholic family in the suburbs of New York. She was raised with traditional Catholic values and attended Catholic schools. Betty was an attractive and popular young woman who met Daniel Broderick III when she was a teenager. Dan was several years older than Betty and was pursuing his education with plans to become a doctor. They began dating when Betty was still in high school and Dan was in college. Betty and Dan married in April 1969 when Betty was 21 years old. At the time of their marriage, Dan was just starting medical school. Betty worked multiple jobs to support them financially while Dan pursued his education. She worked as a teacher and took on additional work to pay their bills and cover Dan's tuition and expenses. This arrangement was common at the time, and Betty fully supported Dan's ambitions. She believed she was investing in their future together and that once Dan established his career, they would both enjoy the benefits of his success. During the early years of their marriage, Betty and Dan started having children. Their first daughter Kim was born in 1970. They went on to have 3 more children over the next decade. Their second daughter Lee was born in 1971. Their sons Daniel IV and Rhett were born in 1976 and 1979. Betty was managing a household with 4 young children, while Dan continued his education and early career. After completing medical school, Dan decided to change direction and pursue law instead of practicing medicine. He attended Harvard Law School, and Betty continued to support the family financially and emotionally during this extended period of education. The Broderick family moved to San Diego, California in the late 1970s. Dan had completed his law degree and joined a prestigious law firm specializing in medical malpractice. San Diego offered good opportunities for Dan's legal career and seemed like a good place to raise their children. Betty focused on being a mother and homemaker, while Dan worked extremely long hours building his law practice. The family lived comfortably but not extravagantly during these early years in San Diego. By the early 1980s, Dan Broderick had become very successful as an attorney. He was earning substantial income from medical malpractice cases, and the family's financial situation improved dramatically. They moved to a large house in an expensive neighborhood. They joined country clubs and socialized with other wealthy and prominent San Diego families. Betty and Dan appeared to have achieved the American dream. Dan was a respected attorney. Betty was a homemaker raising 4 children, and they lived an affluent lifestyle that reflected Dan's professional success. However, beneath the surface of this successful marriage, problems were developing. Dan worked constantly and was rarely home. When he was home, he was often tired and stressed from work. Betty felt neglected and unappreciated. She had spent years supporting Dan through medical school and law school, raising their children largely on her own while he studied and worked. Now that they had finally achieved financial success, Dan was never around to enjoy it with her. Betty began to feel that she had sacrificed the best years of her life supporting Dan's career and was now being taken for granted. In 1983, Dan hired a 21-year-old woman named Linda Kolkina as his legal assistant. Linda was young, attractive, and single. She had been working as an airline stewardess before taking the job at Dan's law firm. Linda was blonde and thin and represented everything Betty was not at this stage of her life. Betty was in her mid-30s, had given birth to 4 children, and looked like a typical suburban mother. Linda was a decade younger, had no children, and maintained the appearance of a carefree single woman. Betty soon became suspicious that Dan was having an affair with Linda. She noticed changes in Dan's behavior and schedule. He worked even later hours than before, and seemed to find reasons to avoid being home. When Betty confronted Dan about Linda, he denied any inappropriate relationship. He insisted that Linda was just his employee, and that Betty was being paranoid and jealous. He became angry when Betty questioned him about Linda and accused Betty of being unstable and irrational. Betty's suspicions were correct. Dan and Linda had begun an affair shortly after Linda started working for him. They were seeing each other secretly while Dan continued to deny anything was happening. This deception would become a major source of Betty's anger and sense of betrayal. She knew something was wrong, but Dan repeatedly lied to her face and tried to make her feel like she was crazy for suspecting the truth. This gaslighting intensified Betty's emotional distress and feelings of powerlessness. The marriage deteriorated rapidly through 1984 and 1985. Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic as she struggled with the knowledge that her husband was betraying her. She made scenes at social events, drank heavily, and confronted Dan and Linda in public. She left angry messages on Dan's office voicemail. She drove her car into the front door of Dan's house after he had moved out. Her actions were desperate attempts to get Dan's attention and force him to acknowledge what he was doing to their marriage and family. On Dan's birthday in 1985, Betty drove to his house and threw a chocolate cream pie at him in front of their children. This incident demonstrated how far Betty's behavior had spiraled and how the conflict between Dan and Betty was affecting their 4 children who were caught in the middle of their parents' war. The children ranged in age from about 6 to 15 years old and were witnessing their parents destroy each other with increasing intensity. Dan filed for divorce from Betty in February 1985. He moved out of the family home and into his own place. He continued his relationship with Linda while the divorce proceedings began. Betty was devastated by the divorce filing. She had spent 16 years married to Dan, supported him through medical school and law school, raised his 4 children, and now he was leaving her for a younger woman, just as he reached the peak of his earning potential. Betty felt she was being discarded after giving the best years of her life to Dan and their family. The divorce proceedings became extremely bitter and contentious. Dan used his legal expertise to control the process and put Betty at a disadvantage. He was a successful attorney with knowledge of how to manipulate the legal system. Betty had no independent income and limited knowledge of legal matters. Dan controlled the family finances and used this control as leverage. He restricted Betty's access to money, forcing her to ask him for funds to pay bills and support their children. Betty's behavior during the divorce process became increasingly volatile. She left hundreds of profane and threatening messages on Dan's voicemail at work. She would call him at all hours, leaving screaming messages filled with obscenities. She vandalized his property and harassed him constantly. Dan responded by seeking restraining orders against Betty and documenting all of her threatening behavior. He was building a case to portray Betty as mentally unstable and dangerous. The court proceedings dragged on for years. Dan had the financial resources to hire the best attorneys and drag out the process with various motions and delays. Betty struggled to find adequate legal representation and often felt she was being treated unfairly by the legal system that seemed to favour Dan, who was a respected attorney. The judge handling the case made decisions that Betty felt were biased against her. She was ordered to pay fines for her harassing behaviour. Her custody of the children was restricted and eventually taken away completely. The most painful aspect of the divorce for Betty was losing her children. Dan sought full custody, and the courts eventually granted it to him. Betty went from being the primary caregiver who had raised the children from birth to having limited or no contact with them. Dan had the resources to provide a stable home and could argue that Betty's erratic behaviour made her an unfit mother. The children were put in the middle of their parents' conflict and were forced to choose sides. The financial settlement was also a major source of conflict. Betty felt entitled to a significant portion of Dan's wealth, since she had supported him through years of education and his early career. Dan argued that his success was due to his own abilities and work ethic. The divorce settlement took years to finalise. During this time, Betty lived in a smaller house and struggled financially, while Dan enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle with Linda, who had moved in with him. Dan and Linda were married in April 1989, less than 2 months after Dan's divorce from Betty was finalised. For Betty, this marriage represented the ultimate betrayal. Dan had denied the affair for years, put her through a brutal divorce, taken her children, and now was publicly celebrating his new life with the woman he had cheated with. Betty felt humiliated and destroyed. Everything she had worked for and sacrificed for had been taken away and given to a younger woman who had done nothing to deserve it. After Dan and Linda married, Betty's mental state deteriorated further. She was obsessed with Dan and Linda and could not move on with her life. She drove by their house repeatedly. She continued to leave threatening messages. She talked constantly about how unfair everything was and how Dan had ruined her life. Friends who tried to help Betty move forward found that she was incapable of letting go of her anger and desire for revenge. In the months leading up to the murders, Betty made numerous statements to friends and family about wanting Dan dead. She said things like, "He deserved to die," or "She wished he was dead." Some people who heard these statements took them seriously and were concerned Betty might actually harm Dan. Others dismissed them as angry venting from someone going through a painful divorce. These statements would later be used in court to demonstrate premeditation and that Betty had been planning to kill Dan. On November 5th, 1989, Betty drove to Dan and Linda's house in the Marston Hills neighborhood of San Diego. She took a .38 caliber revolver that she had purchased earlier. She went to the house in the early morning hours, around 5:30 a.m., when she knew Dan and Linda would be sleeping. Betty later claimed she went to the house to talk to Dan, but she brought a loaded gun, which contradicted this claim. Betty had a key to the house because it had been her house before Dan got it in the divorce. She let herself in through the front door and went upstairs to the master bedroom. She entered the bedroom where Dan and Linda were asleep in bed. What happened next was captured in Betty's own testimony and the evidence from the crime scene. Betty stood in the bedroom with the gun. She later claimed that Linda woke up and screamed or said something, though the exact sequence of events is disputed. Betty fired 5 shots from the revolver. The first shot hit Linda in the head, killing her almost instantly. Dan was also shot as he tried to respond to the sudden violence. He was hit in the back and chest. Both Dan and Linda died in their bedroom from the gunshot wounds. After shooting Dan and Linda, Betty left the house and drove away. She initially fled south toward the Mexican border, but then changed her mind and returned to San Diego. She called her daughter Lee from a payphone and told her what she had done. Lee urged her mother to turn herself in to the police. Betty then went to the police station and surrendered herself to authorities. Betty was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution argued that Betty had planned the murders and had gone to Dan and Linda's house with the intention of killing them. They pointed to her statements about wanting Dan dead, the fact that she brought a loaded gun, and that she went to the house at a time when she knew they would be vulnerable while sleeping. The prosecution sought a conviction for premeditated murder. Betty's defense attorneys argued that she had not planned to kill anyone, but had gone to the house to talk to Dan. They claimed that the shooting happened in a moment of emotional breakdown after years of abuse and mistreatment by Dan. The defense portrayed Betty as a woman who had been driven to temporary insanity by years of psychological torture during the divorce. They argued she snapped in a moment of extreme emotional distress. The first trial of Betty Broderick began in October 1990. The trial received extensive media coverage as the details of the Broderick divorce and murders were revealed publicly. The case had elements that fascinated the public, including wealth, infidelity, a bitter divorce, and a woman who killed her ex-husband and his new wife. The trial became a referendum on divorce, gender roles, and what happens when marriages end badly. During the trial, extensive evidence was presented about the toxic relationship between Betty and Dan during their divorce. The jury heard the profane voicemail messages Betty had left for Dan. They learned about her vandalism and harassment. They also heard evidence about how Dan had used his legal expertise to control and manipulate Betty during the divorce. The defense argued that Dan had psychologically abused Betty by gaslighting her about the affair, taking her children, and using his legal skills to keep her financially dependent. Betty testified in her own defense. She described years of feeling neglected and unappreciated during her marriage. She talked about sacrificing her own career potential to support Dan through medical school and law school. She explained how devastating it was to discover Dan was having an affair, and then to have him deny it, or making her feel crazy for suspecting the truth. She described the pain of losing custody of her children, and the financial struggles while Dan lived in luxury with Linda. Betty claimed that on the morning of November 5th, she went to the house to talk to Dan, not to kill him. She said she brought the gun for protection because she was afraid of Dan. She testified that she did not remember firing the gun, and that the shooting happened in a blur of emotion and panic. She portrayed herself as a victim who had been pushed beyond her breaking point by years of abuse and betrayal. The prosecution challenged Betty's claim that the shooting was unplanned. They pointed out that she went to the house at 5:30 in the morning, when Dan and Linda would be asleep and most vulnerable. She brought a loaded gun. She had made numerous statements about wanting Dan dead. These facts suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous emotional breakdown. The prosecution argued that Betty had planned to kill Dan and Linda and had executed that plan. The first trial ended with a hung jury. The jurors could not reach a unanimous verdict. Some jurors believed Betty was guilty of first-degree murder, while others felt she was guilty of a lesser charge, or possibly even not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The mistrial meant the case would have to be tried again with a new jury. The second trial began in October 1991. This trial covered much of the same ground as the first trial, but the prosecution refined their arguments and presentation of evidence. The defense again portrayed Betty as a victim of psychological abuse who had snapped under extreme pressure. The jury in the second trial heard the same evidence about the troubled marriage, the contentious divorce, and the events of November 5, 1989. On December 11, 1991, the jury in the second trial reached a verdict. They found Betty Broderick guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict meant the jury believed Betty had intentionally killed Dan and Linda, but that the murders were not premeditated in the first-degree sense. Second-degree murder suggested the killings were intentional, but happened in the heat of passion or without extensive planning. Betty was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life in prison. The consecutive nature of the sentences meant she would serve 30 years to life before becoming eligible for parole. However, the judge added 2 years for illegal use of a firearm, bringing her total sentence to 32 years to life. Betty would have to serve at least 32 years before she could even be considered for parole, meaning she would be in her 70s before having any chance of release. The conviction and sentencing of Betty Broderick sparked intense debate about the case. Some people felt justice had been served, and that Betty deserved to spend life in prison for killing 2 people in cold blood. They argued that no matter how bitter the divorce or how badly Dan had treated her, murder was never justified. Betty had options including walking away and rebuilding her life, but instead, she chose violence and killed 2 people. Others sympathised with Betty and felt she had been driven to murder by years of psychological abuse and an unfair legal system. These supporters argued that Dan had systematically destroyed Betty during the divorce, using his legal expertise and financial resources. They pointed to how he took her children, restricted her finances, and flaunted his new wife while Betty struggled. They saw Betty as a victim of a system that favoured wealthy men and discarded older women. The case raised questions about the treatment of women in divorce proceedings, and whether the legal system adequately protected women who had sacrificed careers to support their husbands and raise children. Betty had given up her own career potential to put Dan through medical school and law school. She had raised 4 children largely on her own, while Dan built his career. When the marriage ended, she lost everything, including her children, while Dan kept his career, his wealth, and started a new family with a younger woman. The 4 Broderick children were deeply affected by the murders and their aftermath. They lost their father and stepmother to violence and their mother to prison. The children were split in their feelings about their mother. Some maintained contact with Betty in prison and supported her. Others were angry about what she had done and felt she had destroyed what remained of their family. The children had to grow up dealing with the trauma of their parents' toxic divorce and the murders that resulted from it. Dan's family and Linda's family were devastated by the murders. They lost loved ones to violence and felt that Betty had taken away people they cared about. They did not accept Betty's portrayal of herself as a victim. They saw her as a murderer who killed 2 people and then tried to justify it by claiming abuse. They attended the trials and advocated for Betty to receive the maximum punishment. Betty Broderick was incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona, California. She has been in prison since 1991. She has been denied parole multiple times. At parole hearings, she has struggled to show remorse or take full responsibility for the murders. She continues to see herself primarily as a victim of Dan's mistreatment, rather than as someone who made a choice to commit murder. This lack of genuine remorse has been a factor in parole boards denying her release. Betty has given interviews from prison over the years. She has maintained that she went to the house to talk to Dan and that the shooting was not planned. She expresses regret that Dan and Linda died, but often frames that regret in terms of how it affected her life, rather than genuine remorse for taking 2 lives. She talks about missing her children and grandchildren and the life she could have had if things had gone differently. The case of Betty Broderick has been the subject of numerous books, television movies, documentaries, and a major television series. The story continues to fascinate people because it touches on universal themes of marriage, divorce, betrayal, and revenge. It raises uncomfortable questions about how far someone can be pushed before they break, and whether there is ever justification for violence in response to emotional pain. The murders happened over 30 years ago, but the case remains relevant to discussions about divorce and its psychological impact. The Broderick case is often cited in debates about how divorce courts treat women, especially women who gave up careers to support husbands and raise children. It is also cited as an extreme example of what can happen when divorce becomes a war rather than a process of ending a marriage with dignity. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 5. Case number Stacey. Castor was a 40-year-old woman living in upstate New York when she was arrested and charged with murdering her second husband, David Castor, in 2005. She was also suspected of killing her first husband, Michael Wallace, who had died 5 years earlier in 2000. Both men died under circumstances that initially appeared natural or accidental, but later investigation revealed they had been poisoned with antifreeze, a substance containing ethylene glycol that is highly toxic when ingested. The case became one of the most notorious poisoning cases in recent American history, and Stacey earned the nickname the Black Widow because prosecutors argued she had systematically killed 2 husbands for financial gain. Stacey Ruth Daniels was born in 1967 and grew up in the Syracuse area of upstate New York. She married her first husband, Michael Wallace, in 1990, when she was in her early 20s. Michael was a maintenance worker and electrician who provided a stable income for their family. Stacey and Michael had 2 daughters together, Ashley and Bree. The family lived in the small community of Clay, New York, which is a suburb of Syracuse. By all outward appearances, they were a typical working-class family living a quiet suburban life. Michael Wallace was known as a hard worker who took pride in his job and provided for his family. Friends and family described him as a devoted father who loved his daughters and was committed to his marriage to Stacey. He had no known health problems and was relatively young and active. There was no indication that Michael was seriously ill or at risk of sudden death. He worked regular hours, came home to his family, and lived what seemed like a normal and healthy life. On January 11, 2000, Michael Wallace died suddenly at the age of 38. Stacey told authorities that she had found Michael unconscious in their bedroom. She called emergency services and Michael was rushed to the hospital but could not be revived. The initial cause of death was determined to be a heart attack. This seemed unusual for a 38-year-old man with no history of heart disease, but it was not unheard of for relatively young people to die suddenly from cardiac events. An autopsy was performed, but it was limited and did not include extensive toxicology testing beyond routine screenings. The medical examiner at the time accepted the heart attack explanation, and Michael Wallace was buried. Stacey received the life insurance payout following Michael's death. The amount was approximately $55,000, which was a significant sum for a working-class widow with 2 daughters to support. Stacey appeared to be a grieving widow trying to hold her family together after the sudden loss of her husband. She had to find ways to support herself and her 2 young daughters as a single mother. After a period of mourning, Stacey began dating again. She met David Castor, who owned a small company called Cortland Carpentry. David had been previously married and had a son from his first marriage. He was a hard-working businessman who had built his carpentry company from the ground up. David and Stacey developed a relationship and married in 2003, about 3 years after Michael Wallace's death. The marriage brought their blended family together with Stacey's 2 daughters and David's son. David Castor welcomed Stacey's daughters into his life and took on a stepfather role. Ashley and Bree, who had lost their father Michael several years earlier, now had David as a father figure. David owned his carpentry business and the house where the family lived. He also had life insurance policies that would provide financial security for his family in the event of his death. Stacey became involved in helping David run his business, handling administrative tasks and bookkeeping for Cortland Carpentry. The marriage between Stacey and David appeared happy to outsiders. They lived in the small town of Wetzel Road in Clay, New York. David continued to run his carpentry business, while Stacey managed the home and helped with business administration. The blended family seemed to be adjusting well. David was described by people who knew him as a kind and generous man who cared about his family and worked hard to provide for them. However, by the summer of 2005, David Castor began experiencing health problems. He complained of feeling ill and having symptoms that included nausea, weakness, and general malaise. These symptoms would come and go, sometimes severe enough that David had to miss work, other times mild enough that he could function relatively normally. David went to doctors trying to figure out what was wrong with him, but the medical professionals he saw could not identify a clear cause for his symptoms. The illness was puzzling because it did not fit a clear pattern of any common disease. On August 22, 2005, Stacey called emergency services to report that she had found David unconscious. When paramedics and police arrived at the Castor home, they found David Castor dead in an office area that had been set up in a back bedroom of the house. The scene was unusual in several ways that would become important to investigators. David's body was surrounded by empty alcohol bottles and what appeared to be evidence of heavy drinking. There was also an empty container of antifreeze near the body. The initial assumption was that David Castor had committed suicide by drinking antifreeze mixed with alcohol. Antifreeze contains ethylene glycol, which is sweet-tasting and can be mixed with drinks to mask the flavour. When consumed, ethylene glycol is metabolized by the body into toxic compounds that cause severe damage to the kidneys and other organs, leading to death. The presence of the antifreeze container and alcohol bottles suggested David had intentionally poisoned himself. Stacey told investigators that David had been depressed and had been drinking heavily in the days before his death. She suggested that the stress of running his business and financial pressures had been weighing on him. She portrayed David as a man who had reached a breaking point and decided to end his life. The scene appeared to support this narrative, with the bottles and the antifreeze container positioned around David's body. However, investigators began to notice things that did not fit with a straightforward suicide. The positioning of David's body and the arrangement of the bottles and antifreeze container seemed staged rather than natural. The office where David was found showed signs that suggested someone had set up the scene to look like suicide, rather than it being the actual location and manner in which David had died. Detectives became suspicious that this might not be a suicide, but rather a murder made to look like suicide. Police decided to conduct a thorough investigation rather than quickly ruling the death a suicide. They sent samples for extensive toxicology testing to determine exactly what substances were in David's system and in what quantities. The toxicology results came back, showing extremely high levels of ethylene glycol, the toxic component of antifreeze, in David's blood and organs. The levels were consistent with a lethal dose that would cause death. However, investigators noted that for someone to have consumed enough antifreeze to reach those toxicity levels, they would have needed to drink a substantial quantity of the substance. As police investigated David's death more closely, they began to look at his widow, Stacey Castor. They learned that this was Stacey's second husband to die under sudden and somewhat unusual circumstances. Her first husband, Michael Wallace, had died 5 years earlier at age 38 from what was ruled a heart attack. While one husband dying unexpectedly might be tragic but not suspicious, 2 husbands dying within 5 years raised red flags. Investigators decided to take a closer look at Michael Wallace's death. Michael Wallace's body was exhumed in September 2005, approximately 5 years after his burial. A thorough autopsy was performed with extensive toxicology testing that had not been done in the original autopsy. The results were shocking. Michael Wallace's remains showed high levels of ethylene glycol, the same poison that killed David Castor. Michael had not died of a heart attack as originally believed. He had been poisoned with antifreeze, just like David. The similarities between the 2 deaths were too significant to be coincidental. The discovery that both of Stacey's husbands had died from antifreeze poisoning pointed strongly to Stacey as the killer. The odds of 2 husbands dying from the same unusual form of poisoning without the wife being involved were astronomical. Investigators theorized that Stacey had poisoned Michael Wallace in 2000 and gotten away with it because the original autopsy did not include the specific toxicology tests that would have detected antifreeze poisoning. Emboldened by this success and facing financial pressures again, prosecutors believed Stacey had used the same method to kill her second husband, David Castor. While police were building their case against Stacey for the murders of her 2 husbands, another dramatic event occurred that added a new dimension to the case. On September 13, 2007, Stacey called emergency services to report that her daughter, Ashley Wallace, was unconscious and unresponsive. Ashley was Stacey's daughter from her marriage to Michael Wallace and was 20 years old at the time. When paramedics arrived, they found Ashley in extremely critical condition, barely alive. Ashley was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked to save her life. Medical tests revealed that Ashley had ingested a massive overdose of prescription medications mixed with alcohol. She had dangerous levels of pain medications and other drugs in her system that should have been fatal. Doctors managed to stabilize Ashley and save her life, but she remained unconscious for an extended period. The initial assumption was that Ashley had attempted suicide by overdosing on pills and alcohol. Near Ashley's unconscious body, police found what appeared to be a suicide note. The note was written in a rambling style and supposedly confessed to killing both David Castor and Michael Wallace. According to the note, Ashley claimed she had poisoned her stepfather David because she was angry at him for some perceived wrong. The note also claimed that Ashley had killed her biological father Michael Wallace years earlier when she was just a teenager. The note expressed remorse and suicidal thoughts, supposedly explaining why Ashley had overdosed. However, investigators immediately became suspicious of the suicide note. The timing was too convenient, coming right as police were building a case against Stacey for the murders of both husbands. The idea that Ashley, who had been a young teenager when her father died, had somehow managed to poison him with antifreeze without detection seemed unlikely. The note appeared to be an attempt to shift blame away from Stacey and onto Ashley, with Ashley's supposed suicide attempt being staged to make it look like she had killed herself out of guilt. When Ashley eventually regained consciousness after several days in the hospital, she had no memory of writing any suicide note. She said she had been at home with her mother Stacey the evening before she was found unconscious. She remembered her mother giving her drinks, but then everything became blank. Ashley insisted she had not tried to kill herself and had not written any confession note. She believed her mother had drugged her and tried to kill her by forcing her to consume the deadly cocktail of medications and alcohol. Forensic analysis of the suicide note revealed important evidence. Handwriting experts examined the note and determined that while it superficially resembled Ashley's handwriting, there were signs that someone had tried to trace or forge Ashley's writing style. The note showed characteristics of someone attempting to mimic another person's handwriting, rather than naturally written text. Computer forensic specialists examined Stacey's computer and found evidence that Stacey had been researching information about antifreeze poisoning, murder investigation techniques, and how to forge handwriting in the period before Ashley was found unconscious. Investigators concluded that Stacey had attempted to murder her own daughter and frame her for the murders of Michael Wallace and David Castor. The theory was that Stacey knew police were closing in on her for the two husbands' deaths. She decided to eliminate Ashley while simultaneously creating a false confession that would take the blame off of Stacey. Stacey had drugged Ashley with a lethal combination of medications and alcohol, then wrote a fake suicide note confessing to the murders in Ashley's name. If the plan had worked, Ashley would have died from the overdose, and investigators would have accepted the suicide note as genuine, closing the cases against Stacey. The attempted murder of Ashley provided prosecutors with additional charges against Stacey and strengthened their overall case. It demonstrated a pattern of Stacey using poisoning as a method to eliminate people who were in her way or who represented financial gain. It also showed Stacey's willingness to kill her own daughter to avoid responsibility for her crimes. The fake suicide note was particularly damning evidence of consciousness of guilt and premeditation. Stacey Castor was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the murder of David Castor, the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and evidence tampering related to the fake suicide note. Prosecutors also formally accused her of killing Michael Wallace, though the passage of time and the original cremation of his body made that charge more difficult to prove definitively. The case went to trial in early 2009. The trial of Stacey Castor attracted significant media attention because of the shocking nature of the crimes. A woman accused of poisoning two husbands with antifreeze and then attempting to kill her own daughter and frame her for the murders was a sensational story. The trial took place in Syracuse, New York, and lasted several weeks. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence of Stacey's guilt across all the crimes she was charged with. The prosecution built their case on several key pieces of evidence. First, they presented the toxicology results showing both Michael Wallace and David Castor had died from antifreeze poisoning. The odds of this happening naturally or coincidentally to two husbands married to the same woman were essentially zero. Second, they presented evidence about the life insurance money Stacey had received after Michael's death and stood to receive after David's death. Financial gain was established as a clear motive for both murders. Third, prosecutors presented the evidence from Ashley's near-death experience. They showed that Ashley had been poisoned with a deadly overdose that she insisted she did not take voluntarily. They presented the fake suicide note and the forensic evidence showing it was forged. They showed the computer searches on Stacy's computer about poisoning, murder investigations, and forgery. All of this pointed to Stacy as someone who poisoned people and then created false narratives to cover her crimes. Fourth, the prosecution presented witnesses who testified about Stacy's behavior and demeanor after each death. Multiple people testified that Stacy did not seem genuinely grief-stricken after losing her husbands. Some witnesses said she seemed more focused on insurance money and financial matters than on mourning. Others testified that Stacy had made suspicious comments or had behaved in ways that seemed inconsistent with someone who had lost loved ones to tragic accidents or suicide. The prosecution also presented expert testimony about antifreeze poisoning. Medical experts explained how ethylene glycol poisoning works, the symptoms it causes, and how it leads to death. They explained that someone being poisoned with antifreeze would experience symptoms over a period of time before dying, which matched the timeline of David Castor's mysterious illness in the weeks before his death. The experts testified that the levels of ethylene glycol found in both Michael Wallace and David Castor were consistent with deliberate poisoning rather than accidental ingestion. Stacy's defense attorneys argued that the evidence against her was circumstantial, and that there was no direct proof that Stacy had administered the poison to either husband. They suggested that both Michael and David could have ingested the antifreeze on their own, either accidentally or as suicide. They pointed out that there were no witnesses who saw Stacy give antifreeze to anyone. They argued that the presence of antifreeze in the bodies proved poisoning occurred, but did not prove who did the poisoning. Regarding Ashley's overdose, the defense suggested that Ashley might have actually attempted suicide and written the confession note herself while in a disturbed mental state. They argued that Ashley's claims that her mother drugged her were unreliable because Ashley had been unconscious and had no clear memory of what happened. The defense portrayed the prosecution's theory as speculation based on suspicious circumstances rather than solid proof of guilt. The defense also attempted to present alternative explanations for the evidence. They suggested that David Castor might have committed suicide because of business and financial stress. They argued that the fake suicide note might not have been as clearly forged as the prosecution claimed. They tried to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors by questioning the certainty of the forensic evidence and expert testimony. However, the defense faced an uphill battle against the mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing to Stacy's guilt. The pattern of two husbands dying from the same unusual poison, combined with the attempted murder of Ashley and the forged suicide note, created a compelling narrative of a serial poisoner. The jury would have to believe in an extraordinary series of coincidences to find Stacy not guilty. Ashley Wallace testified at her mother's trial, which was an emotionally devastating experience. She had to face her mother in court and testify that she believed her mother had tried to kill her. Ashley described the evening she was poisoned, testifying that her mother had given her drinks and that she remembered feeling increasingly sick and disoriented before losing consciousness. She firmly stated that she had not attempted suicide and had not written the confession note found near her body. Ashley also testified about her relationship with her late father Michael Wallace and her stepfather David Castor. She described David as a kind stepfather who had treated her and her sister well. She expressed her belief that her mother had killed both her father and stepfather. The testimony was particularly powerful because it came from someone who had been victimized by Stacy and had nearly died as a result of her mother's actions. The trial also featured testimony from Stacy's younger daughter Bree, though Bree's testimony was more limited than Ashley's. The case had torn the family apart, with the daughters having to confront the possibility that their mother was a murderer who had killed their father and stepfather and had tried to kill their sister. The family dynamics and the betrayal of trust were tragic elements of an already horrific case. After hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury deliberated on Stacy Castor's fate. On February 5, 2009, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Stacy Castor guilty of second-degree murder in the death of David Castor. They found her guilty of attempted second-degree murder of her daughter Ashley Wallace. They found her guilty of providing false written statements which related to the forged suicide note. The jury convicted Stacy on all the major charges against her. Regarding the death of Michael Wallace, the jury could not convict Stacy of murder because of the way the charges were structured and the evidence available. However, the judge and prosecutors made clear that they believed Stacy had killed Michael Wallace, even if a formal murder conviction for that death was not possible. The pattern of poisoning and the toxicology evidence from Michael's exhumed body made it clear to everyone involved that Stacy was responsible for his death as well. Stacey Caster was sentenced to 51 years to life in prison. She received 25 years to life for the murder of David Caster, an additional 25 years to life for the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and a concurrent 1 to 3 years for the evidence tampering. The sentences were structured so that Stacey would have to serve 51 years before becoming eligible for parole. Given that she was 41 years old at the time of sentencing, this meant Stacey would be in her 90s before having any chance of release. Effectively, she was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. The sentencing hearing was emotional, with victim impact statements from family members of David Caster and from Ashley Wallace. They described the pain and trauma caused by Stacey's actions. They talked about the loss of David, who had been a loving husband, father, and stepfather. Ashley spoke about the betrayal of having her own mother try to kill her and frame her for murders she did not commit. The victims' families expressed satisfaction that Stacey would spend the rest of her life behind bars for her crimes. Stacey Caster maintained her innocence despite the conviction. She insisted she had not killed anyone and that the jury had gotten it wrong. She claimed she was a victim of circumstantial evidence and a rush to judgment. However, her protests of innocence were not believed by the court, the victims' families, or the public who followed the case. The evidence was too overwhelming and the pattern too clear for most people to doubt her guilt. Stacey was incarcerated in the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York. She remained in prison, maintaining her innocence and filing appeals that were ultimately unsuccessful. The conviction was upheld on appeal, with appellate courts finding that the evidence supported the jury's verdict and that the trial had been fair. Stacey's attempts to overturn her conviction or reduce her sentence were denied. On June 11, 2016, Stacey Caster died in prison at the age of 48. The cause of death was reported as a heart attack. She had served approximately 7 years of her 51-year-to-life sentence. Her death meant she would never serve the full sentence and would never have the opportunity to be considered for parole. For the victims and their families, Stacey's death brought a form of closure, though it could not undo the pain and loss she had caused. The case of Stacey Caster became one of the most well-known poisoning cases in modern American criminal history. It has been the subject of numerous true crime television episodes, documentaries, and detailed media coverage. The case is often cited as an example of a Black Widow killer, a term used to describe women who kill multiple spouses or partners, often for financial gain. The use of antifreeze as a poison was particularly notable because it is an unusual murder weapon that can be difficult to detect without specific toxicology testing. The case raised awareness among medical examiners and law enforcement about the importance of thorough toxicology testing in suspicious deaths. Michael Wallace's death had been ruled a heart attack in 2000 because the initial autopsy did not include tests for antifreeze poisoning. If those tests had been done, Stacey would have been caught after her first murder and David Caster's life might have been saved. The case led to discussions about improving autopsy protocols to catch poisoning cases that might otherwise be missed. The attempted murder of Ashley Wallace was particularly shocking because it involved a mother trying to kill her own daughter. The fact that Stacey was willing to sacrifice Ashley's life to save herself from prosecution demonstrated an extreme level of selfishness and lack of maternal instinct. Ashley survived the poisoning attempt and has had to live with the knowledge that her mother killed her father, killed her stepfather, and tried to kill her. The psychological trauma from these events has been profound and lasting. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to case number 6. Case number 6. Lynn Turner was a 911 emergency dispatcher and mother of 2 when she was arrested and convicted of murdering 2 men in her life using antifreeze poisoning. Her first victim was her husband, Glenn Turner, a police officer who died in 1995. Her second victim was Randy Thompson, her boyfriend and a firefighter, who died in 2001. Both men died under circumstances that were initially believed to be natural causes, but later investigation revealed they had been deliberately poisoned with ethylene glycol, the toxic chemical found in automotive antifreeze. The case became one of Georgia's most notorious poisoning cases, and Lynn Turner earned infamy as a Black Widow killer who murdered 2 men for life insurance money. Julia Lynn Womack was born in 1968 and grew up in the metro Atlanta area of Georgia. She met Glenn Turner when they were both young adults. Glenn was working as a police officer for the Cobb County Police Department in the suburbs north of Atlanta. He was known as a dedicated and hard-working officer who took his job seriously. Glenn and Lynn married and started a family together. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The family lived in Cobb County, where Glenn continued his work in law enforcement, while Lynn eventually got a job as a 911 emergency dispatcher. Glenn Turner was well liked by his fellow officers and was considered a good cop who served his community with dedication. He worked regular shifts with the Cobb County Police Department and came home to his wife and children. Friends and family described Glenn as a devoted father who loved his kids and tried to be a good husband. He had no known serious health problems and was a relatively young man in his 30s who should have been in the prime of his life. On March 3, 1995, Glenn Turner became seriously ill. He started experiencing symptoms that included severe nausea, vomiting, and general physical distress. The symptoms came on suddenly and were severe enough that Glenn needed immediate medical attention. Lynn called for emergency help, and Glenn was transported to the hospital. Despite medical treatment, Glenn's condition deteriorated rapidly. His organs began to fail, and doctors could not determine what was causing his sudden and catastrophic illness. Glenn Turner died on March 3, 1995, the same day he became ill. He was only 31 years old. The death of a young police officer shocked the Cobb County law enforcement community. Glenn's fellow officers and the entire police department mourned the loss of one of their own. The initial assumption was that Glenn had suffered some kind of sudden medical emergency, perhaps a heart attack or stroke, though this seemed unusual for someone so young, with no history of serious health problems. An autopsy was performed on Glenn Turner's body to try to determine the cause of death. The medical examiner conducted a standard autopsy, but the initial findings were inconclusive. The doctors could not identify a clear natural cause for Glenn's sudden death. However, without specific evidence pointing to foul play or poisoning, the death was eventually attributed to a heart condition. The medical examiner ruled that Glenn had died from cardiac arrhythmia, which is an irregular heartbeat that can cause sudden death. This explanation was accepted, even though it did not fully account for all of Glenn's symptoms and the rapid progression of his illness. After Glenn's death, Lynn Turner received life insurance benefits. As the widow of a police officer who died while employed, Lynn was entitled to insurance payouts and possibly other death benefits. The exact amount she received was substantial enough to provide financial support for her and her 2 young children. Lynn appeared to be a grieving widow trying to cope with the sudden loss of her husband while raising their children as a single mother. In the years following Glenn's death, Lynn continued working as a 911 dispatcher. She eventually began a romantic relationship with Randy Thompson, a firefighter who worked for the Cobb County Fire Department. Randy was also in public safety work, just like Glenn had been. Randy and Lynn developed a serious relationship, and Randy became a father figure to Lynn's 2 children from her marriage to Glenn. Randy moved in with Lynn, and they lived together as a couple, though they never formally married. Randy Thompson was known as a dedicated firefighter who was committed to his work. He was well respected by his colleagues at the fire department and was considered a reliable and skilled firefighter. Randy had a previous marriage that had ended in divorce, and he had children from that earlier relationship. He was trying to build a new life with Lynn and seemed happy in their relationship. Friends and family saw Randy as a good man who was devoted to Lynn and treated her children well. In January 2001, Randy Thompson became seriously ill. He started experiencing symptoms very similar to what Glenn Turner had experienced 6 years earlier. Randy suffered from severe nausea, vomiting, weakness, and overall physical distress. The symptoms were intense, and Randy's condition declined rapidly. Lynn took Randy to the hospital, where doctors tried to treat him, but they struggled to identify what was causing his illness. Randy Thompson died on January 22, 2001, just days after becoming ill. He was 32 years old, almost exactly the same age Glenn Turner had been when he died. The death of another relatively young and healthy man connected to Lynn Turner should have immediately raised suspicions, but initially it did not. Randy's death was treated as a medical emergency and tragic loss. The initial assumption was that Randy had suffered some kind of sudden illness or medical crisis that led to his death. An autopsy was performed on Randy Thompson's body. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy noted that Randy's organs showed signs of damage consistent with some kind of toxic exposure, but the specific toxin was not immediately identified. Unlike with Glenn Turner's death, the medical examiner in Randy's case was more thorough and suspicious. The examiner ordered extensive toxicology testing to try to determine if Randy had been exposed to poison or toxic substances. The toxicology results came back, showing extremely high levels of ethylene glycol in Randy Thompson's system. Ethylene glycol is the primary toxic ingredient in automotive antifreeze. When consumed, Ethylene glycol is metabolized by the body into toxic compounds that cause severe damage to the kidneys and other organs, leading to organ failure and death. The levels found in Randy's body were consistent with a lethal dose that could only have come from deliberately consuming or being given antifreeze. The discovery that Randy Thompson had been poisoned with antifreeze immediately changed the investigation from a natural death to a homicide. Detectives with the Cobb County Police Department began investigating who could have poisoned Randy and how the antifreeze was administered. Lynn Turner became the primary suspect almost immediately. She was the person who had been with Randy when he became ill. She had prepared food and drinks for him. She had the opportunity to poison him. Investigators also learned that Lynn was the beneficiary of life insurance policies on Randy's life, giving her a financial motive for his death. As investigators looked into Randy Thompson's death, they began to reconsider Glenn Turner's death from 1995. The similarities between the two deaths were striking. Both men had been in relationships with Lynn Turner. Both had died suddenly, with similar symptoms at similar ages. Both deaths had resulted in Lynn receiving insurance money. The fact that Randy had been poisoned with antifreeze raised the question of whether Glenn had also been poisoned with the same substance 6 years earlier. Glenn Turner's body was exhumed in 2001, 6 years after his burial. A new autopsy was performed with specific attention to testing for ethylene glycol poisoning. The toxicology tests on Glenn's exhumed remains showed high levels of ethylene glycol, the same poison that killed Randy Thompson. Glenn Turner had not died from a heart condition as originally ruled. He had been murdered by antifreeze poisoning, just like Randy Thompson. The exhumation and new testing proved that Lynn Turner had killed both men using the same method. The discovery that both Glenn Turner and Randy Thompson had been poisoned with antifreeze by Lynn Turner led to her arrest. She was charged with 2 counts of murder. The prosecution would have to prove that Lynn had deliberately given antifreeze to both men with the intent to kill them. The cases were complex because there were no witnesses who saw Lynn administer the poison, and she had initially gotten away with Glenn's murder because the original autopsy had not detected the antifreeze. Prosecutors believe Lynn's motive was financial gain through life insurance policies. Glenn Turner had life insurance through his employment as a police officer. Randy Thompson also had life insurance policies that named Lynn as the beneficiary. By killing both men, Lynn collected substantial insurance payouts that allowed her to maintain her lifestyle and support her children. The prosecution argued that Lynn was a cold and calculating killer who murdered 2 men she was supposed to love in order to collect their life insurance money. The method of using antifreeze as a poison was significant. Antifreeze has a sweet taste that can be masked when mixed with other drinks, particularly alcoholic beverages or sweet drinks like Gatorade or juice. Someone could mix antifreeze into a drink and the victim might not notice the taste, especially if the drink was cold or had strong flavors. Ethylene glycol poisoning causes symptoms that can initially be mistaken for the flu or a stomach virus. The victim experiences nausea, vomiting, and feels extremely ill. As the poisoning progresses, it causes kidney failure and damage to other organs, leading to death if not treated immediately with specific antidotes. For someone to die from antifreeze poisoning, they need to consume a significant amount of the substance. However, the poisoning does not have to occur all at once. Someone could be given smaller doses over a period of hours or even days, with the toxic effects building up in the body until they reach lethal levels. Prosecutors theorized that Lynn had mixed antifreeze into drinks she gave to both Glenn and Randy, possibly over multiple occasions, until the accumulated poison reached levels that caused organ failure and death. Lynn Turner maintained her innocence and claimed she had nothing to do with either death. She insisted that both Glenn and Randy must have died from natural causes, or that someone else must have poisoned them. She denied ever giving antifreeze to either man and said the accusations against her were false. Lynn portrayed herself as a victim who had lost 2 men she loved and was now being unfairly blamed for their deaths. The case against Lynn Turner for Glenn's murder went to trial first. The trial took place in Cobb County, Georgia, where Glenn had worked as a police officer and where he had died. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Glenn had been poisoned with ethylene glycol and that Lynn was the only person who had the opportunity and motive to poison him. They presented expert testimony about how antifreeze poisoning works and how the symptoms Glenn experienced before his death were consistent with ethylene glycol toxicity. The prosecution also presented evidence about the life insurance money Lynn had received after Glenn's death. They showed that Lynn had financial problems and that the insurance payout had helped her financially. They argued that Lynn had seen Glenn's death as a way to solve her money problems, while also freeing herself from the marriage. The fact that she later used the same method to kill Randy Thompson demonstrated a pattern of behavior where Lynn poisoned men to collect insurance money. One of the challenges for the prosecution was proving that Lynn had actually administered the poison to Glenn. There were no witnesses who saw her put antifreeze in his food or drinks. There was no physical evidence like an antifreeze container with her fingerprints or residue in glasses or bottles that could be directly linked to the poisoning. The prosecution had to rely on circumstantial evidence, including opportunity, motive, the medical evidence of poisoning, and the pattern of Lynn being connected to two men who died the same way. The defense argued that the prosecution's case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence and suspicion. They claimed there was no direct proof that Lynn had poisoned Glenn. They suggested that Glenn could have accidentally consumed antifreeze, perhaps at work, or in some other situation where Lynn was not involved. They tried to create reasonable doubt by questioning whether the evidence really proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Lynn was the killer. However, the defense faced the difficult challenge of explaining why two different men in relationships with Lynn had both died from antifreeze poisoning. The odds of this happening by coincidence or accident were essentially zero. The jury would have to believe in an extraordinary coincidence to accept that Lynn just happened to lose two partners to the same unusual form of poisoning without being responsible for it. Testimony during the trial included statements from Glenn's family members who described his relationship with Lynn and the circumstances of his death. Fellow police officers testified about Glenn's character and their shock at losing him. Medical experts explained the toxicology findings and how they proved Glenn died from poisoning rather than natural causes. The prosecution built a comprehensive case that, while circumstantial, painted a clear picture of Lynn as a poisoner who had killed her husband. The jury in Glenn Turner's murder trial deliberated and found Lynn Turner guilty of murder. The verdict came after the jury concluded that the evidence, though circumstantial, was strong enough to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Lynn had poisoned Glenn with antifreeze. The conviction was a significant victory for prosecutors and for Glenn's family, who had waited years for justice. Lynn was convicted of malice murder in Glenn's death. Lynn Turner was sentenced to life in prison for murdering Glenn Turner. Under Georgia law at the time, the life sentence meant she would have to serve a minimum number of years before becoming eligible for parole. The conviction and sentencing brought some closure to Glenn's family and his fellow officers, who had mourned his death without knowing he had been murdered. After being convicted for Glenn's murder, Lynn Turner faced a second trial for the murder of Randy Thompson. The second trial took place in a different county because of the location where Randy had died and legal considerations about where the trial should be held. The prosecution presented a similar case for Randy's murder as they had for Glenn's murder. They showed that Randy had been poisoned with ethylene glycol, that Lynn had opportunity and motive to poison him, and that she had received insurance money after his death. The fact that Lynn had already been convicted of murdering Glenn Turner with antifreeze was powerful evidence in the Randy Thompson trial. It demonstrated a clear pattern of behavior where Lynn poisoned men she was involved with to collect insurance money. The prosecution argued that Randy's murder was essentially a repeat of Glenn's murder, using the exact same method. Lynn had gotten away with killing Glenn for 6 years and had used the same successful method to kill Randy. The defense in Randy Thompson's trial faced an even more difficult challenge than in the first trial. With Lynn already convicted of one antifreeze murder, it was much harder to argue coincidence or accident in Randy's death. The defense tried to argue that the cases should be considered separately, and that the evidence in Randy's case specifically was not strong enough to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. However, this argument was undermined by the overwhelming pattern evidence. Testimony in Randy's trial included statements from his family members and colleagues at the fire department. They described Randy as a good man who had been devoted to Lynn and her children. They expressed their grief at losing Randy and their belief that Lynn had betrayed his trust and killed him for money. The medical evidence showing ethylene glycol poisoning was presented, along with expert testimony explaining how Randy had died. The jury in Randy Thompson's murder trial found Lynn Turner guilty of murder. This second conviction meant that Lynn had now been found guilty by 2 separate juries of murdering 2 different men using the same poison. The verdicts validated the prosecution's theory that Lynn was a serial poisoner who killed for financial gain. Lynn was sentenced to life in prison for Randy's murder, with the sentence to run consecutively to the life sentence she was already serving for Glenn's murder. Lynn Turner's convictions were appealed to higher courts. Her defense attorneys argued various legal issues, including whether the trials were fair, whether evidence was properly admitted, and whether the verdicts were supported by sufficient evidence. The Georgia Court of Appeals and the Georgia Supreme Court reviewed the cases. The appellate courts upheld Lynn's convictions, finding that the evidence supported the guilty verdicts and that the trials had been conducted properly. The courts found no reversible errors that would require new trials or overturning the convictions. Lynn Turner was incarcerated in a Georgia state prison for women. She continued to maintain her innocence despite the 2 convictions and the failed appeals. She gave occasional interviews from prison, where she claimed she was innocent and had been wrongly convicted. However, her claims of innocence were not widely believed, given the strong evidence against her and the fact that 2 separate juries had found her guilty of murdering 2 different men using the same method. The impact of Lynn Turner's crimes extended beyond just the 2 men she killed. Glenn Turner's and Randy Thompson's families were devastated by their losses and by the realization that Lynn had murdered their loved ones. Glenn's children lost their father to murder committed by their own mother. They had to grow up knowing their mother was a killer who had poisoned their father. This psychological trauma was profound and lasting. Randy Thompson's family had welcomed Lynn into their lives, believing she was a good partner for Randy. They had accepted Lynn's children and tried to build relationships with the blended family. The discovery that Lynn had poisoned Randy shattered their trust and left them grieving not just Randy's death, but also the betrayal of someone they had cared about. Randy's children from his previous marriage lost their father to a woman they had believed cared for him. On August 30th, 2010, Lynn Turner was found dead in her prison cell. She was 42 years old. Prison officials determined that Lynn had committed suicide by taking an overdose of blood pressure medication that she had stockpiled. She had apparently been saving her prescribed medications over time and then took a fatal dose all at once. The suicide occurred about 9 years after Randy Thompson's death and 15 years after Glenn Turner's death. Lynn's death meant she would never serve the full life sentences she had received for both murders. The suicide of Lynn Turner brought a complex end to the case. Some people saw it as a form of justice, with Lynn dying by poisoning herself just as she had poisoned her victims. Others saw it as Lynn escaping full accountability for her crimes by ending her life before serving significant time in prison. For the families of Glenn Turner and Randy Thompson, Lynn's death brought a mixture of emotions, including relief that she could never be released from prison, but also frustration that she had chosen her own end rather than facing decades of imprisonment. The case of Lynn Turner became one of Georgia's most notorious murder cases. It has been featured in numerous true crime television programs, documentaries, and media coverage. The case is often cited as an example of a Black Widow killer who murders multiple partners for insurance money. The use of antifreeze as the murder weapon was particularly notable because antifreeze poisoning can be difficult to detect without specific toxicology testing. The case highlighted the importance of thorough death investigations and toxicology testing. Glenn Turner's death was initially ruled natural causes because the original autopsy did not include tests for antifreeze poisoning. If those tests had been performed in 1995, Lynn would have been caught immediately, and Randy Thompson's life would likely have been saved. The case led to increased awareness among medical examiners about the need to consider poisoning in cases of unexplained deaths, especially when the victim was young and previously healthy. The murders also raised questions about how someone can successfully poison another person without being detected. Lynn Turner was able to administer lethal doses of antifreeze to 2 different men without either victim realizing they were being poisoned. The sweet taste of ethylene glycol can be masked in drinks, and the initial symptoms of poisoning can mimic common illnesses like the flu. By the time the victims were sick enough to seek medical help, the poison had already caused irreversible damage to their organs. The financial motive in Lynn's crimes was clear. She received substantial insurance payouts after both Glenn's and Randy's deaths. This money allowed her to maintain her lifestyle and support her children. The prosecution successfully argued that Lynn valued money more than human life and was willing to murder men who trusted and loved her in order to collect insurance benefits. This cold calculation made her crimes particularly disturbing. The fact that Lynn worked as a 911 emergency dispatcher added an ironic element to the case. Her job was to help people in emergencies and coordinate emergency responses, yet she was simultaneously poisoning men in her personal life and watching them die from the poison she had given them. Lynn called for emergency help when both Glenn and Randy became ill, playing the role of the concerned wife or girlfriend while knowing she was responsible for their conditions. This deception demonstrated a capacity for manipulation and acting that made her crimes even more chilling. The two children Lynn had with Glenn Turner faced unimaginable trauma. They lost their father to murder when they were young children. Years later, they learned that their mother had killed their father. They had to process the knowledge that the person who gave them life had taken life from their father. The psychological impact on these children was severe and required extensive counselling and support. They were placed in the care of other family members after Lynn was arrested and had to rebuild their lives without either parent. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the final case of the video. Case number 7. Nancy Kissel was a 39-year-old American woman living in Hong Kong when she murdered her husband Robert Kissel on November 2, 2003. Robert was a high-powered investment banker working for Merrill Lynch in Hong Kong. He was 40 years old and earned millions of dollars per year managing investments for wealthy clients. The couple lived an extremely affluent lifestyle in one of Hong Kong's most expensive residential buildings with their 3 young children. Nancy killed Robert by drugging him with sedatives mixed into a milkshake and then beating him to death with a heavy metal object while he was incapacitated. The case became one of the most sensational murder trials in Hong Kong history and attracted international media attention because of the wealth of the family, the brutal nature of the crime, and the complex personal dynamics that led to the murder. Nancy Ann Keishin was born in 1964 in Michigan and grew up in the American Midwest. She came from a comfortable middle-class background and attended college where she studied to become a teacher. Nancy met Robert Kissel in the late 1980s when they were both young professionals. Robert was working in finance and was ambitious and driven in his career. They married in 1989 and started building a life together. Robert's career in investment banking progressed rapidly, and he became very successful in managing money for wealthy clients. The Kissels had 3 children together, all daughters. As Robert's career advanced, the family moved multiple times to different locations based on where Robert's work took him. They lived in New York for several years where Robert worked on Wall Street. The family enjoyed the benefits of Robert's high income, including expensive homes, private schools for the children, and a luxurious lifestyle. Nancy was primarily focused on being a mother and managing the household, while Robert worked extremely long hours in the demanding world of high-level finance. In 2000, Robert accepted a position with Merrill Lynch in Hong Kong. The job offered him an even higher salary and the opportunity to manage investments for ultra-wealthy clients in Asia. The family relocated from the United States to Hong Kong, moving into a luxury apartment in a prestigious residential building called Parkview. Parkview was one of the most exclusive and expensive residential complexes in Hong Kong, located in the Tai Tam area with views of the South China Sea. The Kissels' apartment was spacious and decorated expensively, reflecting their wealthy status. Life in Hong Kong was very different from what the Kissels had experienced in the United States. Robert worked incredibly long hours at Merrill Lynch, often not coming home until very late at night or spending entire nights at the office. The culture in Hong Kong finance was extremely demanding, with bankers working far more hours than their American counterparts. Robert was managing enormous amounts of money for clients, and the pressure was intense. He was earning several $1 million per year, but was constantly stressed and exhausted from work. Nancy struggled with the transition to life in Hong Kong. She was isolated in a foreign city where she did not speak the local language and had difficulty making friends. The expatriate community in Hong Kong could be cliquish, and Nancy felt like an outsider. She was responsible for managing the household and raising 3 young daughters largely on her own because Robert was always working. The children attended expensive international schools, but Nancy had to handle most of the parenting duties without much help from Robert. The Parkview residential complex where the Kissels lived had amenities including a clubhouse, swimming pools, and recreational facilities. Nancy spent time at the Parkview clubhouse and began taking exercise classes there. She started working with a personal trainer and became friendly with some of the other expatriate wives who lived in the complex. However, her social circle remained limited, and she often felt lonely and disconnected from the life they had left behind in America. In 2002, Nancy met a man named Michael Del Priore, who was a television repairman and worked in the Parkview area. Michael was also an American expatriate living in Hong Kong. He was married with children, but his marriage was troubled. Nancy and Michael began talking and developed a friendship that quickly became romantic and sexual. They started having an affair that continued throughout 2002 and into 2003. Nancy and Michael would meet for sex at various locations including hotels and sometimes at the Kissel apartment when Robert was at work. The affair with Michael Del Priore became the central focus of Nancy's life. She was deeply infatuated with him and spent large amounts of time communicating with him through phone calls, text messages, and emails. Nancy told Michael that she was unhappy in her marriage to Robert and wanted to leave him. She discussed divorce with Michael and talked about building a future together. Michael was also unhappy in his own marriage, and the two fantasized about leaving their spouses and being together. Nancy's relationship with Robert deteriorated significantly during the time of her affair. Robert was rarely home because of work, and when he was home, he was tired and stressed. The couple had stopped having a sexual relationship. Nancy later claimed that Robert had become verbally abusive and controlling. She said he criticized her constantly and made her feel worthless. She also made allegations that Robert had become physically rough with her on some occasions, though these claims were disputed, and no police reports or medical records existed to document any abuse. In late 2003, Robert Kissel began to suspect that Nancy was having an affair. He hired a private investigator to follow Nancy and gather evidence of her activities. The private investigator documented Nancy's meetings with Michael Del Priore and confirmed that she was having an extramarital relationship. The investigator provided Robert with photographs and detailed reports of Nancy's affair. Robert was devastated and angry when he learned the full extent of Nancy's betrayal. Robert also discovered that Nancy had been accessing his email accounts and reading his private communications. He found spyware installed on his computer that was monitoring his activities. Nancy had been tracking Robert's movements and communications, possibly to see if he was also having an affair, or to monitor what he knew about her relationship with Michael. The discovery that Nancy was spying on him added to Robert's anger and sense of betrayal. In October 2003, Robert told Nancy that he knew about her affair and that he wanted a divorce. However, Robert made it clear that if they divorced, he would seek full custody of their 3 daughters and would ensure that Nancy received minimal financial settlement. Robert was furious about the affair and wanted to punish Nancy for her betrayal. He told her that she would lose her children and her comfortable lifestyle. Robert had significant financial resources and access to top lawyers, while Nancy would be fighting a custody battle in Hong Kong courts where she had no family support system. The prospect of losing her children and her financial security terrified Nancy. She was facing the possibility of being left with nothing, while Robert kept the children and the money. Nancy became desperate to find a way to avoid the divorce and custody battle that Robert was threatening. She was also still involved with Michael Del Priore and wanted to find a way to be with him without losing everything in a divorce. During this same period in late October and early November 2003, Robert became increasingly ill with mysterious symptoms. He experienced severe stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, and general weakness. He went to doctors trying to figure out what was wrong, but the medical professionals could not identify a clear cause. Robert thought he might have food poisoning or some kind of stomach virus. The symptoms would improve somewhat and then come back worse. Robert was feeling increasingly unwell and was missing work because of his illness. Unknown to Robert, Nancy had been poisoning him with sedatives and other drugs. She had been obtaining prescription medications and crushing them into powder form, then mixing them into Robert's food and drinks. Nancy had been giving Robert these drugged foods and beverages over a period of days, causing his mysterious illness. The medications were making him sick and weak, though not yet killing him. Nancy was experimenting with how to incapacitate Robert, possibly planning to eventually give him a lethal dose. On November 2nd, 2003, Nancy made a strawberry milkshake for Robert. She mixed a large quantity of sedatives into the milkshake, including medications that would cause drowsiness and incapacitation. The exact drugs Nancy used included multiple types of sedatives and hypnotic medications that she had obtained. She blended these drugs into the milkshake so Robert would not detect them by taste. She gave the drugged milkshake to Robert that evening. Robert drank the milkshake, not knowing it was heavily drugged. Within a relatively short time, the sedatives began to take effect. Robert became drowsy, confused, and physically incapacitated. The large dose of multiple sedative drugs essentially rendered him helpless and unable to defend himself or call for help. While Robert was in this drugged and defenseless state, Nancy attacked. Nancy obtained a heavy metal object and used it to beat Robert. The exact weapon was never definitively identified, but investigators believed it was likely a heavy ornament or decorative object from the apartment. Nancy struck Robert multiple times in the head and body with brutal force. Robert was unable to fight back or escape because of the drugs in his system. Nancy beat him severely, inflicting multiple traumatic injuries to his skull and brain. The attack was prolonged and vicious, with Robert suffering numerous blunt force trauma wounds. Robert Kissel died from the combination of the severe head trauma and the large dose of sedatives in his system. The beating had crushed his skull and caused fatal brain injuries. Even if the head injuries alone had not been immediately fatal, the amount of drugs Nancy had given him was potentially lethal on its own. Robert died in the bedroom of the Parkview apartment, while his 3 young daughters were elsewhere in the residence. After killing Robert, Nancy faced the problem of what to do with his body. She could not simply call the police and report that her husband had died, because the circumstances would immediately raise suspicion. Instead, Nancy decided to hide Robert's body and try to cover up the murder. She wrapped Robert's body in plastic sheeting and secured it with tape. She then rolled the wrapped body inside a large carpet from the apartment. Robert's body, concealed inside the rolled carpet, was very heavy and difficult to move. Nancy had the carpet containing Robert's body moved to a storage area in the Parkview building. She told workers that she needed the carpet taken to storage and supervised as they transported the heavy rolled carpet out of the apartment. The workers had no idea that a dead body was inside the carpet they were moving. Nancy placed the carpet with Robert's body inside into a storage locker in the building, where it would not be immediately discovered. For the next several days, Nancy acted as if Robert was alive and had simply gone away on a business trip. She told people, including her children, Robert's colleagues at work and friends, that Robert had travelled for work and would be back in a few days. She sent emails from Robert's account to make it appear that he was communicating normally. Nancy tried to maintain the facade that nothing unusual had happened and that Robert would return shortly. However, Robert's absence quickly became suspicious to his colleagues at Merrill Lynch. Robert had meetings scheduled that he did not attend and did not call to cancel. He was not responding to urgent work communications. This was very unusual for Robert, who was extremely dedicated to his job and always responsive to work matters. His co-workers became concerned and tried to reach him through Nancy. Nancy continued to claim that Robert was on a business trip but could not provide details about where he was or when exactly he would return. Merrill Lynch contacted the police to report that Robert Kissel was missing. The police went to the Parkview apartment to speak with Nancy about her husband's disappearance. Nancy stuck to her story that Robert had gone on a business trip, but the police found her explanations suspicious and inconsistent. They began investigating Robert's disappearance more thoroughly. As they looked into the circumstances, they learned about the marital problems between Robert and Nancy's affair with Michael Del Priore. Police searched the Parkview apartment and the storage areas. They discovered the rolled carpet in the storage locker, and when they unrolled it, they found Robert Kissel's decomposing body inside, wrapped in plastic. The discovery confirmed that Robert had been murdered and that Nancy had hidden his body. Nancy was immediately arrested and charged with murder. The children were taken into the care of Robert's family members who travelled to Hong Kong. The autopsy and forensic examination of Robert's body revealed that he had died from a combination of blunt force trauma to the head and sedative drug overdose. Toxicology tests showed extremely high levels of multiple sedative medications in Robert's system. The amounts were far beyond what would be therapeutic, and were in the range that would cause severe incapacitation or death. The head injuries showed that Robert had been beaten multiple times with a heavy object. The medical evidence painted a clear picture of Robert being drugged into helplessness and then beaten to death. Investigators examined the Kissel apartment and found evidence of the crime. There were bloodstains that Nancy had tried to clean but had not completely removed. They found traces of the sedative medications that Nancy had used to drug Robert. They recovered electronic evidence, including emails and text messages between Nancy and Michael Del Priore, discussing their affair and Nancy's unhappiness in her marriage. The evidence built a strong case that Nancy had murdered Robert. Nancy Kissel was held in custody in Hong Kong while prosecutors prepared their case. The murder trial began in 2005, more than a year after Robert's death. The trial took place in Hong Kong's High Court and was conducted in English since Nancy was an American citizen. The trial attracted massive media attention both in Hong Kong and internationally. The case had everything that fascinated the public, including extreme wealth, adultery, murder, and dramatic courtroom testimony. The prosecution presented evidence that Nancy had premeditated Robert's murder. They showed that she had been obtaining sedative medications and had researched how to use them. They presented the toxicology evidence, showing the massive dose of drugs in Robert's system. They showed the autopsy findings demonstrating the brutal beating Robert had suffered. The prosecution argued that Nancy had carefully planned to drug Robert and kill him to avoid losing her children and money in a divorce. The prosecution also presented Nancy's affair with Michael Del Priore as a motive for murder. They argued that Nancy wanted to be free to pursue her relationship with Michael, but Robert was standing in the way. By killing Robert, Nancy could potentially inherit his wealth and be free to be with her lover. The emails and text messages between Nancy and Michael showed the depth of their relationship and Nancy's desire to leave Robert. The defense strategy was to portray Nancy as a battered wife who had killed Robert in self-defense or while suffering from diminished mental capacity due to years of abuse. Nancy testified in her own defense and made serious allegations about Robert's behavior during their marriage. She claimed that Robert had been verbally abusive, calling her names and belittling her constantly. She said he had been physically violent, grabbing her roughly and shoving her on multiple occasions. Nancy also made allegations that Robert had sexually abused her, forcing her to engage in sexual acts against her will. She claimed Robert had brought prostitutes to the apartment and tried to force Nancy to participate in sexual activities with them. She described feeling terrified of Robert and trapped in the marriage. The defense argued that Nancy had been driven to kill Robert because she feared for her safety and saw no other way to escape the abuse. The defense also argued that Nancy might have been suffering from depression or other mental health issues that affected her judgment and mental state at the time of the murder. They presented expert witnesses who testified about the psychological effects of domestic abuse and how victims of abuse can sometimes respond violently when they feel cornered with no escape. The defense tried to generate sympathy for Nancy by portraying her as a victim rather than a calculated killer. However, the defense faced significant challenges. There was no documentation of the abuse Nancy claimed to have suffered. She'd never filed police reports, never sought medical treatment for injuries, and had not told friends or family about alleged abuse while Robert was alive. Robert's family, friends and colleagues all disputed Nancy's characterization of him as abusive. They described Robert as a hard-working and devoted father who loved his children. They acknowledged he worked long hours, but insisted he was not violent or abusive. The prosecution attacked Nancy's credibility by pointing out that her abuse allegations only surfaced after she was arrested for murder. They argued that Nancy had invented the abuse claims to try to justify killing Robert and gain sympathy from the jury. The prosecution emphasized that Nancy had been having an affair, had been caught, was facing divorce and loss of custody, and had murdered Robert to prevent losing everything. The prosecution portrayed Nancy as a selfish woman who killed her husband rather than face the consequences of her adultery. The physical evidence was damning to Nancy's case. The fact that Robert had been drugged with massive doses of sedatives before being beaten contradicted any claim of self-defense. If Nancy had been defending herself from an immediate attack, she would not have had time to prepare a drugged milkshake and wait for it to take effect. The premeditation involved in obtaining the drugs, mixing them into the milkshake, and waiting for Robert to become incapacitated showed that this was a planned murder, not a spontaneous act of self-defense. The trial lasted several months, with extensive testimony from dozens of witnesses. The jury heard from forensic experts, medical examiners, Robert's family and colleagues, Nancy's friends, and Michael Del Priore. The coverage in Hong Kong media was intense, with daily reports on the testimony and evidence. The courtroom was packed with spectators and journalists throughout the trial. On September 1, 2005, after deliberating for several days, the jury found Nancy Kissel guilty of murder. The verdict meant the jury rejected Nancy's claims of abuse and self-defense and believed the prosecution's case that she had deliberately murdered Robert. Under Hong Kong law, murder carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment. Nancy was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, which was the standard sentence for murder in Hong Kong at that time. Nancy's defense attorneys appealed the conviction to Hong Kong's Court of Appeal. They argued that there had been errors during the trial that had prejudiced Nancy's case and prevented her from receiving a fair trial. One of the main arguments was that the judge had allowed the prosecution to present certain evidence that should have been excluded. Another argument was that the judge's instructions to the jury on certain legal points had been incorrect or misleading. In February 2010, Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal overturned Nancy's murder conviction. The court found that there had been a serious legal error during the trial related to how the judge had instructed the jury about some of the evidence. The court ruled that this error had potentially affected the jury's verdict and that Nancy had not received a completely fair trial. The conviction was set aside and Nancy was ordered to face a new trial. The decision to overturn the conviction and order a retrial was controversial. Robert's family was devastated that Nancy's conviction had been overturned and that they would have to endure another trial. However, The legal error had been significant enough that the appellate court felt a new trial was necessary to ensure justice was properly served. Nancy's second trial began in 2011, nearly 8 years after Robert's murder. The retrial covered much of the same ground as the first trial, but both the prosecution and defense refined their strategies based on what they had learned from the first trial. The prosecution again presented the physical evidence of the drugging and beating, the motive of the affair and impending divorce, and the cover-up of hiding Robert's body. The defense again portrayed Nancy as an abused wife, but with somewhat different emphasis and witnesses. On June 3, 2011, the jury in the second trial found Nancy Kissel guilty of murder. This second conviction came after the jury deliberated and concluded that despite the defense's arguments about abuse, the evidence proved that Nancy had murdered Robert with premeditation. Nancy was again sentenced to life imprisonment, which remained the mandatory sentence for murder in Hong Kong. Nancy appealed the second conviction, but this time the appeals were unsuccessful. Hong Kong's courts reviewed the case and found that the second trial had been conducted properly, without the legal errors that had marred the first trial. The conviction was upheld, and Nancy's life sentence was confirmed. She would spend the rest of her life in a Hong Kong prison. Nancy Kissel has been incarcerated in Hong Kong's prison system since her arrest in 2003. She has been held in various facilities including Tai Lam Centre for Women, a maximum security prison. Nancy has given occasional interviews from prison, where she continues to maintain that she was an abused wife and that her actions were the result of years of suffering. She has never fully admitted to deliberately planning and executing Robert's murder, instead portraying the killing as something that happened in the context of an abusive relationship. The 3 Kissel daughters lost both parents as a result of the murder. Their father was killed and their mother was imprisoned for life. The children were raised by Robert's family members in the United States. They had to cope with the enormous trauma of losing their father to violence and learning that their mother was responsible for his death. The psychological impact on these children has been profound and lasting. Robert Kissel's family has been vocal about seeking justice for Robert and ensuring that Nancy remains imprisoned. Robert's brother and other family members have spoken to media about the case over the years. They have insisted that Robert was not abusive and that Nancy's portrayal of him as a violent husband is a lie designed to excuse murder. They believe Nancy killed Robert purely for financial reasons and to be free to pursue her affair with Michael Del Priore. The case raised questions about life in the expatriate community in places like Hong Kong, where wealthy families live isolated lives far from their home countries. Nancy's loneliness and isolation in Hong Kong, combined with Robert's absence due to long work hours, created conditions where their marriage deteriorated. However, these factors do not excuse or justify murder. Many people live in similar circumstances without resorting to killing their spouses. The Kissel murder case remains one of the most famous criminal cases in Hong Kong history. It has been the subject of books, television documentaries, and extensive media coverage. The case is often cited in discussions about wealthy expatriate life, domestic violence claims in murder defences, and the Hong Kong legal system's handling of high-profile cases involving foreigners. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.